Chapter 14. Don't Thank Me. Outside the Trinity Inn, many refugees, mostly women and children, were rushing or stumbling hurriedly away from something we couldn't see. Guards from other detachments were moving swiftly towards something that Carl was leading me to. Above the crowds, the towers beside the gate were occupied by the frames of men all aiming their rifles towards that same something we approached. Around the groups of destitute refugees, we went until John, Nathan, and Ramos collided with Carl and I from out of nowhere. Without a word, the three others seized the glasses from the crate in my hands, and all at once they gulped the contents they were intended to enjoy before John moved us along, saying to me, "Thank God you're here, Paul. These people won't stop." I didn't have time to ask for clarification because just then we stepped through a gap in the crowd where guards were formed along the line of charity stalls in the central junction of the open market. Some guards were pushing some of the charity workers towards the safety of the gates, while others hid behind the line of stalls waiting for an escort, disturbed by the whole scene. Some of the other charity stalls and carts in the open space were overturned. Items from rolls of cloth to blankets to tools to cans of food and even simple toys for children were scattered about, while angry, desperate, and daring refugees scrambled to grab what they could. The scene spoke for itself, especially when I saw the congregated mass formed amidst and around the overturned charity stalls. Although there was no leader, the mass didn't need one, and I unslung the submachine gun from my shoulder, placing it in my hands and leaving the crate of glasses beside a lamppost, as I approached the line of enforcers who kept the angry crowd at bay by their appearance alone. Strangely enough, the most vocal members in the mob didn't appear like refugees, but random wasters in all sorts of apparel, but mostly full of men. It was too noisy to make out all that was being said, and even though the words of Lieutenant Michael Camden would tell me, the boys and I took our place in the line of guards, and I was already sick. Once there was a large enough show of force, and once the remainder of our charity workers were safely away from the situation, Lieutenant Camden spoke to the crowd. His speech was short, and although I won't recount it verbatim, it confirmed what I suspected upon sight and the ramifications for failing to comply with the orders of the guard. The charity supplies had run out or were dwindling, causing the workers to announce the problem. What normally would have caused only a few grumbles with faith that there would be more to dole out tomorrow, caused a small riot, evidently spurred on by wasteland visitors and travelers who thought they could get some free stuff if they blended into the refugee masses. There wasn't enough, even if the wastelanders didn't skim from the pool of charity resources, and this inability to obtain the free stuff made the volatile situation go off. The wastelanders and refugees took what they could after the outburst of chaos, but the guards soon arrived, and the sight of so many men with shotguns and automatic weapons showed them that our home's charitable nature would not be abused. The use of a few batons on the knees and backs of certain individuals in the initial quelling of the violence showed the seriousness and called for an all-hands-on-deck amongst the guard. Lieutenant Camden was done speaking, and the mass of roughly 40 angry wasters and refugees slowly dispersed. Although this sort of thing has happened before, it always sickened me. There was no reason for our community to be charitable the way it was other than our faith. We had an obligation and a love for helping those who come to our community in need, but seeing the anger and outbursts in people who we simply didn't have the resources to support was always heartbreaking. This was made even more tragic when there were those who didn't even need what we offered and only sought to benefit themselves in the midst of something as unfortunate as a refugee crisis. As the remainder of the scattered items were picked over by refugees in need as well as the scum of the earth, the remainder of the crowd dispersed. It might not have been noticed by everyone, but as the men under Lieutenant Camden and those of the other detachments left the line to assist the continuation of daily business, the crowds who ran gradually began to flow through the area, and I saw that many of those in the violent crowd only left to take their lingering anger out elsewhere. More people moved into the area, men, women, and children picking over and around the empty stalls in search of scraps when I saw a group of around 8 or 9 from the violent crowd of men pushing and shoving people as they approached the well just across from the Trinity Inn. I motioned for my men to follow, and they silently did so as more guards patrolled the grounds and the site of the incident disappeared by the flowing of the masses. The merchant stalls and caravans along the road saw the easing tension. Their guards relaxed, and some even resumed shouting to bring attention to their wares as the seconds passed. All the while, I followed the group of violent wasters and rioters with my men at a distance until they reached the well. Once there, they dispersed, driving wandering people away with violent shoves or taking up spots against the walls of the nearby shacks to smoke and glare at the passers-by when something caught my eye. Just beside the well, still pulling on the rope to bring up the bucket, I saw a man with his back to me. The man wore light blue jeans, boots, and a loose white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and only half tucked into his pants. I could not see his face or the back of his head, but I didn't need to when I saw that the arms pulling on the rope were wrapped in white cloth. I froze at this, not even registering it when the waster with dark brown hair and a brown padded jacket stepped away from his comrades with a gesture to the one working the well. The wrapped man lifted his head, showing it wrapped in the same cloth as his arms as he poured the water from the bucket into a metal pail. Just like that, the wrapped man placed the bucket back on the edge of the well, and with a bit of effort lifted the pail full of water off the edge of the well before he started to casually stroll away. Almost in slow motion, I saw the burned man do his chore and casually walk on towards the gap in the buildings towards his shack when suddenly he stopped. Graham hadn't gotten but 4 paces away from the well when he stopped in place, turned, and saw the waster in the padded jacket less than a foot from his face. I was too far to hear what was said, but the distance between the two and the intimidating nature of the waster was enough to show the intent and what was being said. I took a step towards the well. A group of refugee women passed before me, and once I could see the burned man again, the waster had one hand on the pail. All at once, the waster shoved Graham, who tripped over a rock behind him. The water pail spilled out onto the ground, and the waster began to kick Graham as he struggled to his feet. Each attempt to stand was prevented when 2 more of the wasters rushed over and joined the assault in less than a second. Not on my watch. Immediately, me and my boys rushed forward, fanning out as we moved, but we hadn't taken more than a few steps across the path when the scene was another riot. Other wasters had rushed towards us and kept me and the others at bay, shouting angry words into our faces that I couldn't even hear beyond my attention that was still fixated on the men pummeling Graham. I couldn't move forward. The long, dark-haired, sunburnt-faced tribal before me was an immovable object shouting in my face. A glance to my side showed Carl and John had pulled out their batons and were pummeling the men, preventing their advance, as I returned to the face before me and felt my hand get closer to the grip of my pistol. Out of my peripherals, I could see Nathan, Ramos, Carl, and John all now resorting to their batons, threatening to be swarmed as each battered man gave way to another. I focused my attention on Graham, who was now only dealing with 2 assailants, while my mouth was being as cordial and demanding as possible to the shouting man before me. Seeing more guards rush upon the scene, I heard a howl pierce the shouting, and I recognized that howl as the one I heard the night we brought in the scorched man. I knew the pain that Graham was dealing with. I'd seen it, I heard it, and I felt it as I watched the 2 wasters continue to beat him with fists and kicks over nothing. As this agonizing howl entered my ears, I had nothing else to say. I removed the pistol from my belt and cracked the tribal man across the jaw, sending his confused, bleeding, and now disfigured face out of my sight and into the ground. I rushed forward, seeing Graham had managed to stand himself up in the second I looked away. He struck one of his assailants before he was driven into the wall by the man in the padded jacket, who pinned him there as he delivered blow after blow. 15 steps from them, I was confronted with another man, hearing the violence of now over a dozen guards trying in vain to suppress this second riot, and hearing that scream, as I imagined the bubbling skin of Graham bursting and bleeding at each blow from his attacker in the jacket. Again, more focused on the violence being done to Graham, I wasn't focused on suppressing or subduing the man preventing my advance. Still inching forward as more guards approached the scene and more wasters and even refugees involved themselves in the brawl, I came close enough to hear the odd word between the painful shouts of Graham's voice. Couldn't just hand it over. Seeing the wrapping on Graham's arms and neck unravel with more blows, I heard the words, "Fucking freak! Stupid ghoul! Mutants don't need fucking water!" More and more shouts at Graham were heard, and even if the bigotry of the wasters for one they thought to be a ghoul or freak was the reason for the assault, it made no difference to anyone in the guard, and the frenzy of the brawl brought in more people to take out the rest of what they hadn't during the first riot. I'd had enough. Just before I dealt with this last person preventing my advance, I saw Graham muster the strength to shove the man in the padded jacket off of him. Graham, his rags dangling from his arms and spattered in red, was immediately pushed back into the wall by two other wasters before he could take 2 steps forward, and once again he was pinned to the wall. I met the eyes of the screaming waster with the dirt-spattered face in front of me, and once again used my pistol to strike him across the face. The waster before me fell to the ground, and just when I thought I was free to close the distance between Graham and his assailants, I felt the grip of the man I felt on my leg. I went to beat him off once more, but before I could do that or beg him not to have me silence him by the true purpose of my pistol, I saw the hand of Graham reaching out to the side. A single arm reached steadily out, while the 2 wasters continued to pummel him against the wall. Graham's original assailant, the man in the padded jacket, watched and laughed only 3 feet distance, while more shouts of unbearable pain pierced the chaos of the brawl around the well. Then I saw what that blistered and bleeding arm was reaching for. Just beside Graham, one of the guards who I didn't recognize in the moment, was like me, trying to stop what was happening to Graham, only to be prevented by a large waster screaming and pushing him. Although the guard was much closer to Graham than I was, he must have arrived later than I, for his hand was holding a baton, hesitating to use it versus the weapon on his left hip. Feeling the grip on my pistol and those hands on my leg, I looked down to see the waster I struck with a face covered in blood, clawing at my leg and screaming curses at me. I felt my pistol move to the head of the man. Whether to fire or strike him again, I don't remember in the heat of the moment. Only, I stopped when the hand of Graham had finally reached the handle of the nearby guard's pistol. Almost collapsing under the blows of so many punches and kicks in such a short time, the piercing shouts of pain from the throat of Graham ceased all at once when the pistol left the guard's holster. The weaponless guard froze, and so did his own assailant. Then, all in the blink of an eye, Graham had swatted both of his assailants in the face. 2 blows in less than a second, and Graham was free. The men before him lay in the dirt, and he stood himself up so tall he appeared a giant, and as if he hadn't been continuously beaten terribly by 4 men in half as many minutes. I looked down, hit the man at my leg once more, and before his grip left my leg, I saw Graham stepping towards the man in the padded jacket like an unstoppable force, while the man who started it all was backing up in desperate retreat at what he saw happen to his comrades. I was free. Nothing and no one else prevented my intervention. But before I could take a single step forward, the waster in the padded jacket had extended a hand of truce. Graham took the hand as if to shake it, only to pull the man closer and strike him in the face just as he'd done to the others. All in a single motion, the waster who started it was on the ground, backing up and leaving a few specks of blood in the dirt. My mind caught up to the present, and just as I began my charge forward to stop what was going to happen, the final moment arrived. Graham had stepped on the groin of the man in the padded jacket, preventing him from crawling away further. The scorched arm with dangling tattered and bloody cloth leveled the pistol at the head of the waster. I shouted "No" at the top of my lungs, and the whole world seemed to freeze as the pistol was fired 7 times before the audible click of the pistol's slide locking back. I don't know why exactly I shouted "no" in the moment. Every part of me at the time, and even in the present day, told me his action was justified. I had cracked my weapon across the heads of 2 men during the second riot in the market that day. Although I don't believe I killed either men, wounds to the jaw or blows to the temple can often prove deadly or crippling to those who called the wastes their homes. I don't know what happened to those men. I didn't care. And I also didn't know what happened to the others in the brawl who fell. After the 7 shots, the world remained still, and a brief survey of my surroundings in the ensuing calm showed a scene I hadn't witnessed before. Probably 15 guards, and at least twice as many wasters all turned at the gunfire, while maybe a dozen more wasters and guards alike were scattered about the scene, too wounded, or not conscious enough to take notice of what had happened around that well. The violence had ended, and all eyes were on the lone figure standing over a still body, only a few feet from the source of water. Looking back, I think I shouted no because of a fear inside that I hadn't bothered to contemplate further in the days and weeks leading up to the incident. As justified as Graham was in doing what he had done, or what I believed he had done, that fear inside was that the burned man who disgraced our community for so many years returned to us in need, but had not changed. What I feared was that the moment he fired that pistol to kill the man who started the thing, whether justified or not, his killing of the man would show the community who welcomed him back that there was still just cause for keeping him outside the walls. If he killed the man, he would confirm what all those within the wall internally feared. Graham was still at heart and soul, the man of nightmare and atrocity who led the Legion, a nation of slavers, murderers, and rapists for decades. My fear appeared to reign true as the seconds of silence passed, and the dust settled to expose the still body on the ground before him. My fears were confirmed. Graham had not changed, and the monster inside was still present when the last of the smoke from the gun barrel disappeared into the cold breeze. I hadn't even noticed that the dirt around the head that gun was aimed at sat free of any indication of the deed I thought done. Then, beyond the smallest spattering of blood in the dirt around the waster's head, the only truly noticeable puddle around the still body was not around the head of the waster, but around the groin. The brawl around the well was still frozen in place with all eyes glued to the standing figure, and perhaps it was only a few seconds, but it felt as though hours had passed before the onlookers, and I saw the chest of the body on the ground begin to rise and fall. Immediately, my fears of Graham's reversion to the monster of legend were gone, but still sitting dormant as I could only watch what then unfolded. As the puddle around the waster's groin grew steadily wider, and the chest started to rise and fall, it had only fallen 3 or 4 times before Graham dropped the empty magazine out of the guardsman's .45, pulled another one out of his pocket, and my mind recalled my detachment's gift bucket a few weeks back as he pressed the lever, and the slide sent another round into the chamber. Silence continued its reign when he stepped over the man, dropping to one knee as he took the man's collar in one hand, and pressed the muzzle of the gun to the man's head with his other. It was then that I noticed the disturbed dirt directly around the shaking head of the waster, and now curious about the small puddle of blood where it rested. Graham pulled the collar, bringing the pistol-whipped face up, showing a broken nose streaming blood, a purple jaw, and a set of eyes widened in terror fixated on the half-wrapped face of the beast he thought he could destroy. With the head raised, I looked back at the disturbed dirt around the head, and saw that although the burned man had shot directly around the head of the man, at least one shot had illustrated the point further. The bright red and dripping mess where the man's left ear should have been was only a clearer indication of what had truly happened when the gunshot subdued the whole scene. The ear on the waster's left side had been shot clean off, and I could only presume the same happened to his other ear when I saw the second little puddle of blood in the sand after the head was raised. With everyone still stunned, the scorched and covered face of Graham hovered but a few inches from the terrified instigator when the silence ended by the piercing, croaking, pained and enraged voice of Graham shouting,
"Do you have anything else to say?"
The waster only shook, his eyes seemingly unable to look away from, but also unable to look into those of the half-wrapped man. All the waster could do at the shock of losing his ears in a volley of gunfire from the beast holding him mercy was stutter something unintelligible. At that, a moment passed, and the face of Graham grew neither further nor closer from that of the waster before Graham screamed,
"Nothing else? Not even an apology? Not a thanks for sparing my useless life?"
Graham paused once more, and the mouth of the waster stuttered again something indecipherable before the eyes widened and the waster sputtered out, Thanks. The ears of the man were sheared off, but still he could hear through the coagulating blood dripping down the sides of his head, and Graham racked the gun again, sending the round that was already in the chamber flying out of the weapon into the dirt. The loud clack of the gun and gesture served as a simple warning to indicate his intent as the waster's eyes widened even more to the point of nearly popping out of his head as Graham screamed,
Thanks? Who are you thanking?
Ever so slightly more collected, the waster's eyes went briefly to the cold steel pressed to his forehead before stuttering out once again. Thank you, sir, for sparing. The words were stopped by the grip of Graham's pistol colliding terribly with the side of the waster's head. Right in the blood-pouring mess where his left ear was, the man let out the most horrific scream that morphed into awful sobs that Graham silenced by manually closing the jaw with one hand, while placing the muzzle right back where it was previously. The waster's muffled sobs were silenced, giving way to hyperventilation as Graham continued to lord over the man. The waster cried and choked as the grip of Graham locked the mouth shut, and Graham let loose a snarl of pure rage before he screamed into the broken face.
Don't thank me!
Graham stopped, releasing his grip on the waster's jaw, and an awful gurgling sound was made when the jaw fell open, releasing a torrent of blood. The waster sobbed hysterically, coughing, spitting, and frantically trying not to choke on the blood pooling in his mouth, amidst his terror of the man completely in control of him. For the life of me, I couldn't move an inch. I wanted to stop Graham, help the waster, help Graham, just stop this scene, but all I or anyone could do was quietly watch, waiting to see what the wrapped man would do with the one who started this whole thing. Perhaps Graham was stirred by the sobs, and perhaps he did not want to see a man die in such a way, even though part of me felt he'd finished people off in this manner before. Graham stared silently at the mess before him, raising the collar and head higher once more, and the blood streamed from the man's mouth down his chest, coating his shirt and jacket. Although Graham might have allowed the man not to die from drowning in his own blood, he still had a point to make, and he had to ensure the waster knew that it wasn't the one holding the gun to be thanked. There was a reason Graham wouldn't accept the apology, a reason the waster was struck for his answer and reduced even more to that crippled, crying and bloody state. The waster looked nothing like a person as he collected himself, and the streams of blood and tears poured endlessly. The gun remained pressed to the waster's head as Graham corrected the man, shouting into that bawling face,
Don't you fucking dare thank me.
More tears and blood flowed down the waster's face and Graham's tone stayed at its chilling intensity.
You thank God. You thank the Lord Jesus Christ for his mercy upon you today, because it certainly wasn't mine that's letting you survive this shit you couldn't finish.
He pulled the face closer, keeping the same pressure of the muzzle on the forehead and not lowering his volume one bit as he screamed full of rage and authority the rest of his demand.
It's only because of him that your brains are still in your head and not splattered all over this fucking ground. Got it?
The waster's sobs choked to a slow halt, and I think everyone there, perhaps all of New Canaan, and anyone who came to our home this day got the message. The waster nodded slowly, face covered in bruises, blood, dirt, and tears, seeming to know that now was his part. Another trickle of blood fell from his mouth, and with his eyes shut at the terrible pain he knew he alone was responsible for, the waster stuttered, Thank you God, Jesus. I'm sorry. He almost couldn't finish, his words distorted by more blood dripping out of his mouth, and immediately, when he was done giving his apology through that broken mouth and face, he burst into another torrent of tears. Graham released his grip on the collar, the waster's head collapsed back into the dirt, and Graham, in a voice completely devoid of his fiery rage from seconds earlier, but still serious and menacing as it always was, said,
Consider yourself forgiven.
Then Graham stood himself up, looked down at the sobbing form in a puddle of blood from his ears and urine from his regretful choices, and then said, calmer still,
I'll forgive you tomorrow.
Before he silenced the form with one ruthless boot to the face. The waster fell into unconsciousness, the kicks sending several teeth into the dirt beside him, and Graham put another round from his pocket in the magazine of the weapon as the matter was formally ended. The whole market still sat frozen in place. I saw that even the guards atop the distant gate towers were lined along the railing in stunned silence. Graham looked to the guard he borrowed the pistol from, tossed it towards him with a full, fresh magazine. The guard caught it without even trying and holstered it without a word as Graham bent down to pick up his water pail. The ground around the overturned pail was now dry, the sun was setting, and upon standing himself back up, it appeared that this was the moment his pain from his burns and the pain from the beatings caught up to him. He clutched his stomach in one hand, empty pail in the other, and the bleeding, broken body shuffled towards me of all people, ever so slowly. I still could not move, but could only watch as more pain consumed him. Half his scorched skin was exposed to the world as the wrapping hung off his person in bloody tatters, but still he got closer. At last, when he was but 2 paces from me, he shoved the empty pail into the hands of a waster beside me that I hadn't even noticed. The waster just at my right was evidently one of the ones who was friends with the one in the padded jacket who started it all. With the pail in the hands of the stunned waster beside me, Graham said,
"You and your friends clearly need this more than I do. And take your friend to the clinic."
The waster beside me dropped the pail and ran to the still body of the one in the padded jacket, already beginning to drag him away by the arms, and Graham silently extended his hands toward me. Without even thinking about it, and with a mind still flooding with thoughts and memories about all I'd seen, I bound his hands with my shackles and walked him towards the gate to New Canaan, as life resumed a little more behind us with each step. The cleanup after the storm was already underway, and the splash of such an event continued to ripple as the waves of people returned to their business and lives that afternoon. Graham had changed. Our community's returned son had shown it in his own brutal way that afternoon. The incident also proved that the monster inside of him that created those terrible stories when he campaigned with the Legion was still very much alive. The fire that consumed his body could not destroy that terrible monster within, but it matters not what we have inside, it matters what we do with it. Our gospel holds peace and love for our fellow man above all else, but what's to be done when something so evil comes along it refuses to bow before love, or simply won't leave? I don't believe I am theologically equipped enough to understand all the particulars, but even our Lord drove the wicked from his Father's temple with a whip and by force when he saw the evil being done within. Although the incident that day would cause many mixed feelings within the community, there was no denying that mercy was shown, as brutal as that mercy was. The man lived, and was later removed from the clinic of Dr. Franklin. But some other truths about the incident were brought to light. Our brother still creates waves whether he tries to or not, and it's what we do with the things inside us that matters. Chapter 15. No more half measures. It was long past the end of my shift when I was finally able to return to my home and family that day in the market, before the sun had set on the event in which Graham spared the waster who started the almost market-wide brawl. The elders, temple leadership, constable, and all the lieutenants of the guard were aware of the situation. It wasn't until word spread about what happened with Graham in particular, and my arrival with him in chains, that brought the community within the walls to a halt. After being told to place Joshua Graham in a cell by the barracks, the metal and concrete insulated 15 by 15 foot box next to Cade's, I was immediately sent to a small series of meetings with the constable. One by one, every guardsman who was there for the first riot around the charity stalls was brought in following their replacement, by reserves from the night guard who were sent to fill in. Then, every guardsman who witnessed the brawl and incident with Graham was brought before the constable to give their interviews and statements about what happened. I was one of the first to meet with the constable beside Lieutenant Camden for that first meeting regarding the initial riot. After that short interview where I didn't have much to say, I was waiting outside on a chair while each guardsman was called into the constable's office on the top floor of the barracks to be interviewed. The officers on patrol and the officers in charge of the overlooking tower detachments were told to stand by after the first interview, and something stuck with me as more and more guardsmen came in for the second interview. As it may have become known, the constable was not an angry or bad-tempered man. The man almost never raised his voice at anyone other than to perhaps call attention to someone from a distance, or to give orders over the crack of gunfire, And this event was met with such calm I didn't know what to make of it. As I sat outside his office following that first meeting, I thought back to the moments immediately after showing up before the constable with Graham in a pair of shackles. By that time, the constable was already aware of the violence in the market, but the sight of Graham did little other than make the friendly constable's business-like emotion on his face even more sullen. My interview about the first event was short, most likely because I wasn't there to watch how it started, but even the interviews of the other lieutenants and guardsmen were short as well. Recalling his change in demeanor, I found this somewhat puzzling, and although I had no reason to believe the constable's anger or frustration would be heard through the door, part of me believed this would be one of those few occasions once Graham was in a cell. Part of me feared this even more when the first ones were called in for interviews about the second event. Yet there was nothing to be heard through the closed and locked door, as one person went in after another. I didn't know what the temperature of the constable's office would be before the second interview, but after the first guardsman came out, the young man did so with a smile across his dusty and bruised face. The man's part in the quelling of the violence before Graham's vicious sermon showed very noticeably on his face, yet it did not distract from the smile etched into it by his mouth. That smile seemed to somehow say it all, and as each guardsman was called before the constable for their second interview, those men waiting outside subtly became more audible about their view of Graham's actions. The low conversations throughout the small room full of occupied chairs turned into casual chatting, then laughing as more men came out of the constable's office smiling about something. Me and the other officers present for the incident were silent, more focused on composure than the lower guards who began to engage enthusiastically with one another about the events as more of their friends came out. It took me a while after the whispers turned into full-on conversations to take in what was being said, but then I did, and the reaction from the other men who protected our community became intelligible. While I was still completely confused and lost in regard to what I thought of the event, the battered and bruised men of the lower guard were nearly ecstatic about it. They loved what happened in the market, they loved what happened to the waster, and their admiration for what happened only increased in volume as more men exited the constable's office with smiles on their faces. I began wondering anxiously what this interview with the constable was going to entail, but I was apparently alone in this as the lieutenants beside me began to whisper and chuckle about the event themselves. Based on the smiles of everyone who left the office, I started to believe that the constable was giving them all private celebrations about the event. But then I again remembered what the constable's face looked like as I relayed my experience of the first riot in that first interview. There was no way that Constable Hanshaw, who sat across from me with a face of stone-cold contemplation and severity, was happy about what he was having to do in the wake of such an incident. There must have been some other reason for the smiles that left that office, but I couldn't fathom that reason until it gradually began to make a little more sense with each conversation I overheard happening around me. Looking around, everyone on the top floor waiting for their turn with the constable was telling one another where they were in a brawl, which waster they dealt with, and how they dealt with them. I caught bits of conversation, here and there, guards pointing out their friends who were with them, and some went on quoting what Graham had said, as if to act out the scene again. Between the laughing and the joking and the recitations, and so much enthusiasm about the scene in the market, I began to realize that the men's smiles after the meeting had nothing to do with the constable or how the interview went. What they saw Graham do only an hour and a half earlier could not be swayed by anything, even if the constable did turn into a ravenous beast when the door to the office was locked behind them. Personally, I still did not know what to make or think of the whole thing. I couldn't quite figure out why the guardsmen and even some of my fellow lieutenants at this point were taking the whole thing the way they were. I could only think about the face of that waster, so broken and disfigured, and so incredibly terrified underneath all that blood. I thought of those screams and the sound of that man crying as the burned man held his head up and pressed a pistol to it. Even memory of the scene nearly made me shudder, as I felt a cocktail of emotions, from sympathy to shame to horror to admiration, to worry about what was to come of the event. The lieutenant on my right was called into the office, and I heard more of what the guardsmen were saying. With a mind totally focused on the pitiful sight of that waster's horror-stricken face, as the burned man lorded over him, I stood myself up, unsure of what I was going to say, if anything. The loudest part of me felt like screaming. How can you laugh about this? That man was a human being." However, as soon as I stood, and before my tongue could speak, Nathan and John had taken notice of me from their chairs across the little open room and shouted at me with faces brightened by cheer and an enthusiasm I hadn't ever seen before. "Hey, Lieutenant Young," exclaimed Nathan, holding his wrapped arm in a sling, and adding, "Where's Graham now?" I froze, forgetting what I was going to say as the eyes of everyone in the room were upon me. Conversations between guards throughout the room were lowered to whispers, as they all looked at me with their eyes open wide and beaming. It was here that I just then realized something that eluded me while I was lost in my own thoughts. I studied each face, lining the edge of that room, all the way to those sitting against the railing down to the second level. There I noticed every single guard in the room sat in their place with a bright, smiling face, and each one of them bore some kind of splint or bleeding wrap somewhere on their bodies or heads. Some of them were like Nathan, holding a bandage-wrapped arm in a slings. Some had a uniform pant leg rolled up, exposing a dirty wrapping around one or both legs. Some had their shoulders wrapped with the dried blood peeking out from underneath the hasty wrapping. Some had one or both hands bound in the same tattered wrapping, while one man was shirtless with the same, wrapping around the entire center of his chest. This realization made me freeze and forget what I wanted to say even more, as I came to understand a bit more of the reason for those smiles on the faces of each man who left the constable with their account of the second riot. Looking around the room, and seeing all those bloody and bruised men smiling at me standing before them all, it came to me clear as day as the words I heard in waiting rang in my mind. These men wearing the same wrappings around their wounds as Graham were the image-bearers of Graham. They didn't just admire what Graham did to that waster in the market, they adored him for it. Upon discovering this, I was still at a loss with even more to think about. Although it may have only been a few short moments since I stood, I was still trying to figure out why I stood and what I stood for when one of the men, a young man under Lieutenant Camden, asked from somewhere on my right, "They tell you to put him in a cell, LT." I kept looking at my men, seeing John with a blood-speckled bandage around his head kept in place by his cap, and his face wearing the largest smile I'd ever seen on him. Before I could refocus and answer Nathan's question, or the guard who just spoke, another one said jovially, "Hey Schroyer, you still got the crowbar? I'm up for busting him out. You in too, Lieutenant Young." Everyone laughed, and the entire room exploded with a joy unlike before. The lieutenants beside me laughed. Nathan, John, Carl, and Ramos laughed, even leaning on the shoulders of the boys in Mitchell's detachment to keep themselves upright. I stood in place as the laughter continued, and remembered the face of that waster and my prior rage at the guardsmen's attitudes just for a second. More jokes were spoken aloud about breaking Graham's cell open, and just when I was about to shout my contempt for what I kept hearing, I remembered the sound of Graham's screams as he was beaten so savagely over a pail full of water he would have given to the wasters anyway. If only they'd asked first. I heard those cries of Graham's pain as he was beaten into the ground. Those cries echoed in my mind 1,000,000 times in the 5 seconds after the last question, and the image of all the men around me wrapped and bleeding struck me again as I finally replied, "Let's just see what the constable has to say first." This caused another uproar of laughter amongst the guards and lieutenants in the room as everyone returned to their own conversations with one another. In those words I spoke, I realized I was one of them too. I didn't wear the wrappings of my men, or those of Graham, but I discovered that I too had no true pity for the waster when the screams of Graham's pain echoed in my mind. Only a moment later, and before I could sit back down and resume distantly contemplating what was already done, Lieutenant Pryor exited the office with a smile on his face and a wrapping around his shoulders, saying, "You're up, Young." The second interview with the constable was much longer this time. I relayed everything that happened down to the letter, what was said, what was done, who was there, and where the waster Graham spared most likely ended up. The entire time I spoke, the constable's face remained unchanged from the one I saw in the first interview. Not angry, not sad, not concerned, not anything beyond stern contemplation. As I finished up my testimony of what happened, the constable said, "Hold that thought, Paul." He turned from me and adjusted something on the radio atop his desk, apparently turning the knobs to tune it as a faint static began to whir beyond the muffled laughter heard outside the office. After a moment, he lifted the receiver I hadn't seen from its place behind the bulky radio set and spoke into it. "Did you catch that, Mr. Albright?" I wondered if the interviews were being recorded at the mention of one of the temple elders' names. Just then, the other end spoke, understood. "Thank you, Mr. Hanshaw," said the static voice of Elder Albright. "Mr. Harlan? Bishop Mordecai?" asked the constable, as I wondered if all the elders were hearing this directly. Not to mention my surprise at the mention of the bishop himself being on the other end when he was most likely at home during this time in the late afternoon. The two elders and bishop did catch all I had said, and although I didn't doubt that we were being recorded for future discussion, I didn't know that they or the bishop themselves were listening in directly. Still, it was only the two elders and bishop who were hearing this, and before I could think about anything else, the constable looked back up at me and said coolly, "Sorry about that. Go on, Paul." A brief silence ensued as I switched gears and replied simply, "No problem, Constable. I was done anyway." At that, his eyes lingered on me a moment longer, still without any change in his expression as he looked back down at the receiver with the words, "Anything else, elders? Bishop?" The radio stayed silent for a moment, presumably as the elders and bishop talked to one another on a different frequency, until the bishop himself spoke for me and the constable. "That should be enough for now, gentlemen. Have the lieutenants stand by and dismiss the rest of the guardsmen back to their duties, or to have their wounds tended to. That's all we need to hear." The constable dismissed me to relay the order, and I stepped out. As the guards of the detachments involved dismissed back down the stairs, me and the other 3 lieutenants there for the second riot stood by. The laughter and loud conversation of our men fading into the distance as our men departed back downstairs. Once our men were gone, the lieutenants turned around, and the constable was already walking towards the stairs, making us follow with the words, "Follow me." The constable led us to the meeting room with the wide windows above the museum and archives building, overlooking the town square across from the temple. And there all the elders were assembled. Some of the elderly men of the temple were entering almost as we were, dressed in their casual attire. Upon taking our places across from the temple leadership, the first of a series of meetings began. I'll keep the whole thing short by saying that after the other elders had been caught up on what happened in the market only a couple of hours earlier, an argument began. Most of us defenders of the community were silent, as the argument was for the large part amongst the temple officials. The elders turned to us when necessary and for clarification on certain aspects being discussed. But for the most part, the arguing was largely about whether or not Graham acted justly. It eventually turned into disputes about whether or not Graham was at fault in the first place, and the majority was glad he was sitting in the cell. After coming to this conclusion, the meeting was adjourned, and I returned home around an hour and a half after I would have normally gotten off. At home, I caught my wife up on what kept me for so long, and the decision was made to not discuss it amongst ourselves, and certainly not our children. Hearing Michelle, Hannah, and even Joe talk about the rumors they heard about the event, the wife and I dismissed them as just that, and the next morning came. With the arrival of the next morning, I wasn't at my station in the East Tower for more than an hour and a half before one of Hanshaw's runners stepped up to the top saying for me, John, and Carl to follow him. Again, I entered the meeting room above the archives, leaving my men with those of the other lieutenants to talk in the waiting room outside as we entered at the request of the constable. Once again, we took our seats across from the elders, now all dressed in their white and black robes, when this second meeting commenced. By this second meeting, all the elders were aware of what was said in the numerous recorded interviews with the constable, hence the request for certain lower guardsmen who waited outside. With all the elders aware of the situation, the second meeting began with a renewed argument about whether or not the actions of Graham were justified. It was no longer the case that they were at the same conclusion. No longer were the elders all glad for his confinement to a cell, but the majority were unchanged, leading to the men outside to come in one by one and stand before the leaders of the community to account for what was said in the interview. Although I was pretty glad Nathan wasn't asked to give his testimony, I still wasn't sure how I felt about John's. I could have easily mistaken the testimony of John for that of Nathan, who I assumed would have been overly enthusiastic and inappropriately happy about what Graham had done. After becoming a little more ashamed of John, my second, I realized I didn't want to be a hypocrite, for I was still one who shared the general sentiment of the lower guard, even if I could conceal my true feelings more professionally than John or Nathan. The meeting went on, and a shameful theme was soon articulated after even the first guardsman stood to give his testimony. The guard was glad about what happened. This much was well known by the elders during this meeting, and numerous condemnations were sent towards we officers about the discipline and demeanor of our men. All the while, the constable remained silent, twisting his mustache in contemplation and taking the lectures just like me and my fellow lieutenants of the guard. After the lower guards outside were dismissed, the men across the table still argued, but the argument turned towards how long to keep Graham confined to his cell and whether or not to exile him. The meeting was soon adjourned, and the constable led us lieutenants out of the room with the quiet order to return to our stations, as his face showed visible agitation. Later on in the day, as the men and I stood atop the towers still speaking their admiration for Graham aloud, I remained silent on the matter, taking note of the strange new spirit I'd seen in them. Shortly after 2 p.m., the constable arrived atop our tower, greeted the men as cheerily as he could with a mind focused on other matters, and the guards took the arrival of the constable to display an extra vigilant watch on the market. It became clear where the attention of the guards were focused when I saw their heads all turned toward the open area where that well stood. The traffic of the day, and even the charity stalls, were still handing out provisions to the masses of refugees, this time with more guards standing by, and I turned to the silent constable sitting on my chair next to the table with the radio set. Seeing his face locked in stern contemplation, I asked him plainly, "What do you think should be done with Graham?" There was no visible reaction on his face, or shift in his eyes, but I did catch the ears of my men prick upward out of the corner of my eye, as he said in a resigned but an entirely certain way. The elders like to argue, and sometimes feel more free of sin than others, but I want what they'll end up doing. Part of me knew what he was talking about, but I couldn't articulate it either if I was asked to do so. Then he said, "Just wish we didn't have to go through the whole show." I wasn't entirely sure what he was referring to, but I would later. Not long before the close of our shift, the constable's runner called me to the meeting room again, this time without any of my men, and the third meeting began. Although the elders had turned away from their conclusion to exile Graham, the argument about what they heard in the interviews continued. More lectures about the attitudes of our guards were occasionally sent towards we officers sitting across from the temple leadership. There was still plenty who condemned the actions of our men to quell the riot, as well as the actions of Graham. Strangely enough, however, it was sometimes those elders who said things like, "We are not a community of barbarians," and "Where was grace shown in ranks of our guardsmen during the savage beating of the wasters?" were sometimes the very same ones who said, "The guards need to defend themselves, and Graham was the victim here." It was when I heard these statements that the words of the constable began to make a bit more sense. Just wish we didn't have to go through the whole show. That's what this was. It was all a theological discussion. These men, our community's elders, knew the truth and probably knew what their conclusion would, probably after that first meeting. Talk of exile, talk of condemnation, and talk of what should have been done was just that. Talk. I'm not against tackling issues from many angles, but no matter the dilemma or situation like the one with Graham, the answer could all be found in the book our community reads and tells the world about. In particular, the answer could be found if one reads the parable of the prodigal son and knows what the father did for the son. In that story, the father welcomed the son into his home anyway. By the end of this meeting, it came to a close and they arrived at their newest conclusion. Graham had a right to defend himself, but the degree to which he did so should be condemned, not celebrated. That was more or less where I had landed on the whole thing after the dust had settled, even if my subconscious already did in the moments after the fight. After all the lectures, throughout that third meeting, I remembered the broken face of that wastelander, the horrible sounds of his sobbing, and the sounds Graham made when he too was broken from the beating of so many men. I arrived at home probably an hour after I was supposed to get off, and the night with my family went much like the previous one before the next morning arrived. A knock at the door said I was to immediately head to the meeting room after the morning muster. Once again, me, the other lieutenants involved, and the constables sat before the elders. This fourth meeting was unlike the other ones. No longer did the elders argue about whether Graham was right. No longer were U.S. members of the Guard lectured about what we failed to do to de-escalate the situation. No longer were they discussing the fate of Graham. I don't know what was said when we left, or what was talked about over the elders' Tuesday dinner last night. Instead, the meeting started with a simple question. Bishop Mordecai, who'd been largely quiet in the past 3 meetings while his elders argued, started this meeting with a question directed at the constable while his eyes were on me. How long until this gets out? There was mention of the outlaw Doyle and I brought in over 2 weeks back, and the discussion was locked onto the topic of who was there in the fight. How many onlookers, how many fighters, what were people saying, etc. I was called upon and reiterated what was said in my interview, how it seemed like the violent wastelanders started the fight by apparently trying to steal water from someone they thought was a ghoul. It was in this meeting that I revealed I hadn't heard anything else in the market. No new stories about the ex-legate, and no new whispers about who it was that stood over the wastelander with a leveled gun and explosive words about the brutal mercy he attributed to Christ. All was silent outside, but the incident was still, from everyone I'd talked to since the event, known to all. I thought of all the caravanners and traders who come and go from our markets each day, how many travelers who saw that happen only to leave and continue their journeys that night, and the elders must have considered this as well. All the elders' previous intentions to exile Graham were forgotten in an instant, and despite a few more lectures coming our way about the guard's demeanor, there was something they refused to tell us directly that made the elders leap to the final suggestion of Elder Larsdale. We need to close up his house outside the walls. The bishop suggested that Graham be released from the cell, and have any wounds immediately tended to if they hadn't been already. The particulars of Graham's decided fate were unknown to me after the guards were dismissed, but the constable was told to hang back, and we lieutenants were told to wait for him outside. Approximately 30 minutes passed in the waiting area by the staircase to the museum level, and us lieutenants remained largely quiet. We talked lowly to pass the time, but our minds were still on everything from the fate of Graham, to the incident that took 4 meetings, to which detachments we would have doing what on this coming day and that. We weren't waiting for more than 35 minutes before the constable stepped through the double doors, dismissed the others, and caught me by the shoulder, asking, "Do you and Daniela have groceries and room for a guest?" The face of the constable was no longer sullen as it had been the past 2 days. Now it was calm, and the faintest hint of his normal smile was on his face as mine turned to confusion by the question. "It should only be a few days while quarters are arranged, and the elders will compensate you for the expense." It was decided. The incident in the market, where Joshua Graham expressed his love of our Lord through a hail of bullets, was where the elders, the guard, and the community of New Canaan as a whole decided that we could no more attempt to simply forget about his return to our home. No more could we let him live an unknown incognito existence just outside the community. With the options of turning him loose, or fully embrace him as one of our own within the walls, the elders begrudgingly decided that there could be no more half measures in regard to the nature of Joshua Graham. The matter would stay quiet amongst the community, but little by little people would understand what was done, whether it was by word of mouth, or by seeing him walk the cobbled streets within the safety of the walls. Joshua Graham was a secret we could no longer leave outside. He was one of us. We had decided that during the night in the temple, and it was now time to act upon the next step of what was started. Graham's presence within the walls would remain somewhat controversial in the days, weeks, and eventual months following this decision. The elders didn't make their decision out of love for what he did, but more out of necessity and commitment to the path they originally started down when I brought him into the temple the night after his return to our home. Not all would like his presence, as word of him outside the walls remained unspoken by guard and New Canaanite alike, but he had those who loved what he showed he stood for, and I stood uncertain, at least outwardly. I still didn't like what he did to the waster he held in his grip, but I understood it. I understood the pain he endured at the hands of those who simply wouldn't leave him be, and I knew what kind of men there were out there beyond the walls, and even those who would come to our gates despite the authority of our guardsmen. Even if I couldn't outwardly show my agreement with what he'd done, I was at least inwardly at peace about the event. Although I did not walk away from the market wearing the bandages like the men of the lower guard or those of Graham's identity, I knew the world out there was brutal, and sometimes it needed to be met with a similar brutality. However, even then, there was still a place for God's mercy. In the meantime, I agreed to shelter Mr. Graham, while the rest of the temple's leadership figured out what his place in our community would look like, and where he would live. I only wished this new arrangement didn't fall on the same day I offered to host dinner for the community, an elder's beloved career missionary, Daniel. Chapter 16, Communion with Friends, Part 1. 2 days after the incident in the market, a selected group of guards were sent to release Graham from the small cell behind the barracks next to the outlaw Tom Cades, while I was allowed to go home and let my wife know about the guest we were about to offer lodgings. The constable said they would probably begin packing up Graham's possessions from his shack outside the wall before they released him, so I had some extra time as well. Unfortunately, I remembered to ask Danny if she was able to make an extra few portions for Mr. Mathers, Daniel the missionary, and anyone else who might tag along before I mentioned the guest situation. I don't believe I intentionally left out the name of our guest, but Daniela almost didn't mind when I mentioned having Daniel and Mr. Mathers over for dinner. She was friends with and occasionally did some work with the people of missions coordination, and we'd had Daniel over for dinner several times in the past. She only asked if it was Daniel who would be staying with us, and I didn't have to say anything further as she immediately took on the assumption and expressed how his presence in the house would do wonders for Hannah and Joseph's enthusiasm about their studies. I decided not to correct her and say who our guest would really be. I didn't know what her reaction would be, so I decided to surprise her as well as myself. I departed, and she said this was the perfect day to do those Brahmin steaks and smoked vegetables she got in bulk with the last shipment from the folks of Jude. It was only the late morning, and the kids were still at school, but the news of a guest staying with us and a nice dinner with friends had her immediately begin a thorough house cleaning, while she set out the guest bedding on the couch and tried to get as much done as possible before getting an early start on dinner. She was happy to hear that I wouldn't be held late again by meetings, and was so excited to have friends over that she didn't even ask about the meeting's conclusions, or ask for a reminder on what those meetings were even about. It warmed my heart to see my wife in such a jovial manner before I left, and although she was kept busy almost every day with garden tending, cleaning, preparing meals, sewing for half the neighborhood, laundry, women's groups, volunteering at numerous trades across town, picking up the kids, tutoring the kids, fetching the water, and so much more, she rarely had the opportunity to host friends for something as relaxing as a casual dinner. Walking toward the other end of town, I passed one of the constable's runners on my way to Graham's cell who said the guys clearing Graham's place could use an extra set of hands. I exited the gates into the market and passed my men who stood by our normal station beneath the East Tower. I caught my men up briefly on what was happening and decided not to tell them who I was hosting as they were still evidently lively about this event of the day and that one. Not to mention their lingering enthusiasm about the notable event of days previously. They only asked me if this morning's most recent meeting was the final one. I told them I thought it was, and the boys remained duty-bound to keep their enthusiasm in check, as they asked what was to come of the prisoner. I didn't answer that. Time would tell them. And perhaps they'd be able to put 2 and 2 together when I re-entered the community with Graham's possessions in hand. Meeting up with the crew in charge of moving Graham's possessions inside the community, I was surprised to see that me and the other 6 guardsmen could get it all in one go. The shack looked unchanged from the one I entered to overhear the words of Miss Neal. The burned man had scarcely a single thing to his name, save for the items in those gift baskets and buckets that were left for his bedside upon arrival at Dr. Franklin's clinic. Of course, most of those baskets were lighter, and there was one full of wrappers of food items, but how he managed to make even these last for over 2 weeks was unknown. There it strangely occurred to me that there would have been one more gifted pail, if it hadn't played a crucial part in Graham's new living arrangements. Once all was collected up, me and the other men headed for the gate and went back inside as the guards of my detachment and the ones of the station opposite them were staring at what we had in hands. I told the crew to make for my house and leave the buckets beside the gate of my front yard or by the porch, and they departed while I made my way to the barracks and cells behind them. Although it may not be necessary, I'll explain that the cells behind the barracks were not some large sector of the town. The cells were not part of any prison, but merely a collection of 8 identical 12 by 12 foot concrete and metal structures along the east wall of our community's home. At the time of this event, I believe only 4 of the cells were inhabited, one by Tom Cade, one by Joshua Graham, and I don't remember who inhabited the others. The cells were small and looked rather ominous from the outside, but all had 2 small barred windows along the top of the front and rear sides, and each connected to the same air conditioning and heating unit. It wasn't often that we dealt with criminals from the outside or even inside the community, so the cells were almost never at capacity, but each one had a single set of bunk beds, a cushioned chair, a locker for clothes, a nightstand beside the bed, a toilet and sink connected to the nearby cisterns for this part of town. Despite the 2 Bibles atop the nightstands, there wasn't anything else in any of the cells, so they weren't the most horrible things in the world by the standards of almost any other community in the wastelands. Still, the cells were more of a locker room, or a place to rest between interviews with those in charge of their case, or a place to sleep when the prisoner wasn't working off their sentence in the community's servitude program. I only mentioned the above in order to give an adequate picture of what happened when I motioned towards the guardsman outside the cell marked 7, and he let me in. Graham sat upright atop the lower bunk, while the constable sat coolly and reclined in the armchair across from him. The 2 had scarcely noticed my arrival beyond the glances from both men as the door creaked open. Evidently, the 2 were engaged in a long discussion before my entrance, and although I didn't catch much more than the concluding words, I figured the constable was explaining what was decided in all those meetings. As the 2 concluded their talk, I stood silently by, noticing the constable's face was still easing back to its normal cheery self after the gloom of the past 2 days of meetings. There I noticed Graham was more or less back to himself too, what little I knew of his casual self. Graham sat like a statue in what appeared to be that same pair of dusty and ripped light blue jeans, and if he still suffered from the beating of those wasters, it wasn't shown as he wore a fresh set of bandages over his entire body and hid beneath a new loose white-collared shirt. After maybe a minute, the 2 turned their heads to me for a second, stood up, and the constable shook the burned man's hand as the latter let out a slight groan with the constable's cheery word, "Agreed." Turning to me, the constable walked past me and touched my shoulder, saying, "You got it from here, Paul?" I nodded. He slapped my shoulder and exited with the words, "The temple, and I will keep you updated." Before taking my exit as well, the burned man stepped up to me. I shook his hand with a mind blank, as he said in that deep, stern, and pained voice,
"Lead the way, Lieutenant Young."
Beyond the initial introductions, and beyond what I was perhaps expecting at his arrival, my wife greeted the burned man warmly, and even embraced him after asking if it would be too painful to do so. The man said he didn't mind, and after the introduction and short friendly banter, it was clear she had a lot of work to do before the kids got home and before dinner. The only thing I noticed, even in the short introductory talk, was her frequent glances at me that seemed to say something like, "You could have told me so I'd be ready." Still though, she took it well, and even though she was too busy to help when he and I moved his buckets of possessions inside, she truly seemed to have no issue with the whole thing, even when I said I wasn't sure how long the constable would need him to stay with us, and even if those frequent glances continued well into dinner. When dinner was served, my wife sat opposite from me at the other head of the table that night, enthusiastically engaging in the conversations with Daniel and Mr. Mathers, while still silently darting her eyes almost worriedly from the wrapped man on her immediate right to me, just before asking him kindly, something along the lines of, "Would you like some more water, Mr. Graham?" The man would painfully choke down some of his dinner, stifling a scream from his scorched throat. The room would go silent, my wife's eyes would dart to me, and then everything would return to normal after he replied something like,
"No thank you, ma'am. I appreciate the offer, though."
It was like that almost all afternoon. My wife was friendly, but simply didn't have anything to say to the wrapped man beyond the kind of offers she'd extend to anyone we had over for a visit. She let him help when he asked to help her with something in the kitchen or asked to help her do a chore. She was also friendly, but a few words when he commented on something she and I were discussing in his polite way. But frankly, she never started any discussion or conversation with him. I couldn't tell if this understandable distance was because of the amount she had to do, if she was still frightened by him, or if it was a combination of those two things and probably others. But as I said, The lack of conversing between the two was easily understandable. What would a busy housewife even have to say to a man she'd only ever heard about in nightmare stories of war, slaughter, slavery, and most recently, a miraculous return to Christ after finding him again in a ball of fire? Christ has a way of unifying even the most different of people, but a distance remained. She wasn't the only one to feel this way, and there will be more to say about that unity later. For the most part, Graham stayed silent, especially when the children arrived later that afternoon. And then when Daniel and Mr. Mathers showed up. After the arrival of the others, and after the awkwardness about seeing who was joining the evening, Graham began to take on the presence of something like an interesting antique chair. As opposed to a man, it'll catch your eye pretty frequently, but you aren't really going to go out of your way to chat with it unless you're crazy. What I can say about everyone's reactions and attitudes towards such a guest could probably only really be shown well if I recount the dinner. This is especially since I believe the dinner and all the temperaments of the attendees captured what was in the minds of just about everyone in New Canaan after learning that Joshua Graham was formally here to stay and inside the walls. My son and youngest child sat across from Mr. Graham by his mom, and he couldn't turn his eyes away from the bandaged man, almost forgetting to eat. Joseph was too focused on trying to catch a glimpse of the burned man's true form every time the bandages on his face were lowered for a bite. Hannah sat beside me on my right, keeping one eye on Graham and one on the comic book beneath the table, needing a reminder every now and then to finish her plate. I only allowed the comic book at the table when the conversations between the adults became more adult-oriented. Michelle sat beside me on my left, actively engaged in the stories and topics of Daniel and Mr. Mathers. She became particularly involved when Daniel started telling about his work on the various missions he'd undergone in the past year. Her first mission was still a few months away, but it was coming up, and her excitement was growing by the day, so she had all sorts of things to ask Daniel about. As this topic went on, she'd all but forgotten about the man on the other end of the table she was previously diverting half her focus towards. Many times she'd glance towards me with a raised eyebrow, usually whenever Mr. Graham began that subtle choking sound, seeming to ask mentally if he was all right. Throughout dinner, Mr. Mathers was frequently going between actively involved in the conversations and merriment to short moments of staring at Graham beside him, mouth agape, and seemingly ready to spill out a million questions he was keeping inside. Both Daniel and Mr. Mathers were the prime sources of conversation throughout dinner. The two men of the temple sect held very different roles in the community, but were very good at casual discourse, and had personalities that made them very good with the kids. Mr. Mathers would talk to Joseph and Hannah about their studies, and always eager to talk to other grown-ups. Joseph in particular would answer each question enthusiastically, almost hopping up and down in his seat before his eyes would go back to Graham. As I already said, Michelle was more than happy to have the two men over, and since she was almost a community, certified adult herself, joined in the laughing and interesting stories of the two men like a true socialite. I answered questions that came my way and had lots to say to the two about this and that, refraining from certain topics since there were children at the table, but I likely wasn't as engaged as I normally would have been if we didn't have the wrapped man sitting silently by my wife and occasionally stifling the pain of simply eating. I think all of us knew everyone else's minds weren't completely involved like they would have been, but nobody dared to say anything to Graham. As I said about my wife, I think was true for us all, there just wasn't much to say. And so, the evening was a blast. A dinner with men like Daniel and Mr. Mathers was always a delight to the entire family. The kids were having fun, Danny and I were having fun, and everything was wonderful as we all did a superb job at not talking about that enormous elephant in the room. Although I've only seen pictures of elephants once or twice in my life amongst the pages of barely legible pre-war books, I never quite understood that expression until there was one at my dinner table while I was with my family and friends. As I may have alluded to, Daniel was the primary source of topics and conversations for the evening, going on and answering questions from Mr. Mathers and all of my family members about the missions. It was because of this liveliness in the spirit of my longtime friend of the missions corps that it was only him who seemingly hadn't even noticed Graham at all after the initial introductions. Just as I said above, everyone at the table appeared to have one eye on their food or who was talking and another on Mr. Graham, but Daniel seemed almost unaffected as we all laughed and shared and talked. Despite this fact, it was Daniel himself who first extended an invitation for my bandage-wrapped house guest to join the conversation. It just wasn't done in a way that I, or perhaps even he, would have done had he known better. My eyes were going to Graham rather frequently as Daniel spoke. The missionary was talking to Michelle and all of us about his later work with the Sorrows tribe of Zion, and that naturally led to a topic he mentioned to Mr. Mathers and I briefly at the inn before I was called away to witness the event in the market. Daniel said to Michelle, who'd asked the most recent question, "Dead horses, that's who's been attacking the Sorrows every couple months or so. Them and the children of the canyon, but they aren't too bad when they attack." "That's awful," said Michelle with genuine sadness and fright in her voice. "The Sorrows are so kind and sweet. I was talking to Josie, and the fact a tribe like the Dead Horses would try to raid a people like them just breaks my heart." Daniel said to everyone with a smile, "The Sorrows have been one of, if not my most favorite tribe to work with in recent memory. Josie was right though, and I can tell you firsthand that she showed a kind of bravery I admittedly hadn't thought her capable of during some of the more—" He paused in search of the right word before saying, "frightening attacks." "Josie said it's her mama bear instinct," said Michelle, causing everyone at the table to chuckle or smile. She wasn't kidding. Josie and her work with the kids of that tribe was beyond commendable. I hope the next one to visit the Sorrows picks up where she left off with them. "Hopefully that will be me," said my eldest daughter. "I told her I would love nothing more than to continue that program with the kids. I just pray Mr. Oakley will approve my request after Elder Rockwell has a chance to see it." Daniel must have taken special note of the longing sound in her voice because he finished swallowing the bite he took and said to her with a look of assurance, "I can have a talk with both of them and see what I can do to help make that happen. Michelle." Almost immediately, my daughter's face lit up as she said, "Thank you so much, Daniel. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that." Daniel nodded, and Michelle added, "Hopefully the Dead Horses start to leave them alone by then as well." I mentally said that I would be praying that as well, and Daniel's tone became serious as the delight of making her happy cooled. "Just be careful when you get there, and know that the valley beyond the Narrows is still dangerous. The Zion Valley itself is not as bad as other places in the wilderness, and even if the Dead Horses' attacks are few and far between, a raid by a tribe like them is a very serious matter. They've been trained by the worst of them." Daniel immediately stopped what he was going to say, even if he'd already said it. His eyes remained on Michelle, but the eyes of everyone remained on Daniel, as Michelle asked what everyone except me and Mr. Mathers and Mr. Graham were thinking. "Trained? War tribes get trainers? Ha ha." The laugh on the end died into silence. Although the second of silence was no more than just that, I swore that I saw the eyes of Daniel go straight to the answer to Michelle's question for only a fraction of a millisecond. Nobody else caught it, aside from maybe Mr. Mathers, while Mr. Graham sat there like the statue he was so good at being. Daniel lowered the glass of water from his lips and said to Michelle, "I just mean—" He lowered the glass further, mentally selecting what words he should say and what those words would mean, to who, as he finally said to the mission-eager young woman, "Some tribes like picking on their neighbors, and sometimes those tribes reach out to ones who are the best at that for assistance." The pause, this time again, might not have been more than a second, but it was here he admitted it with courtesy, for all guests at my table. Tribes like the Legion. Sometimes it's even the Legion's best who train the tribes. Graham had not moved one bit. He remained unchanged from his prior position. His plate sat clean, and his back straight, almost as if waiting to be excused. At Daniel's explanation, Michelle just said, "Oh, okay," appearing completely oblivious to the fact that one of the Legion's best, the man who personally trained the Dead Horses to raid tribes like the Sorrows, was right at the very table she sat at, and one chair past Mr. Mathers. Either she was oblivious, or she put the pieces together and refused to acknowledge further out of courtesy, but either way, the conversation took a different turn. Mr. Mathers went on about his work at the ranch outside of town, and I felt the conclusion of the Dead Horses topic was the moment something changed in Daniel. It wasn't truly observable, but I think the talk about the Dead Horses and Mr. Graham's statue-like reaction showed Daniel that even though he might not have the ability to talk about Graham directly, he could perhaps get away with alluding to Graham. Maybe he thought he could get away with similar statements more and more, since it was known by everyone almost at the very start of the evening that he'd been away from New Canaan for nearly a full year without return. Being the man who's been away, it was understandable that he wanted to get caught up on things at home, and even though he knew much, he had only been back for 2 days at this point, and he already knew that his outsider view was the source of much of the evening's joy. A man who'd been out and seen the world might be able to give a fresh set of eyes on topics of recent days, like the day of his return from mission, and the events he hadn't gotten to witness himself from inside the Trinity Inn. This must have led Daniel to eventually say, "It appears there's a lot of unrest here at home these days. I'm saddened to hear about what happened in the market the day of my arrival. Mr. Mathers, my wife, and I felt a strange uneasiness as we 3 said almost simultaneously, 'Truly unfortunate.' I don't think I was the only one to say that, with an allusion to the fact the topic should be left at that." Daniel seemingly didn't take the hint and went right along. "It truly is a sad time when something like a near riot could happen in the middle of broad daylight." His words felt all right for me, supposing he was talking about the first incident where the refugees were turned violent by wasters in the mob, demanding free things at a charitable event. But then Daniel clarified what and who he was referring to. "Mercy is a hard thing to offer in such a situation, and I know you and the guard did all you could, Paul." Glancing at me as he said my name, he resumed, "Still though, I heard one poor fool is still in Dr. Franklin's clinic outside the walls. The man has no ears anymore, almost no more teeth, and I hear he suffered such blows to the head that Dr. Franklin and her staff expect him to stay in an infantile state for the rest of his life." I felt my face heat up slightly, remembering Graham standing over the man who started the whole thing at the expense of his ears and mental well-being. There remained a chance that Daniel didn't know who exactly put the man of that description in such a state, but I felt as though he mentioned me and the guard's commendable job beforehand in order to say he wasn't talking about me or my men's actions in the second riot. Lifelong damage for one mistake is a tragic thing. I hope the man recovers enough to take care of himself. If not, he might as well have just been killed," said Daniel, causing a lingering silence. I was aware of the condition of the waster Graham had punished over the course of those meetings about the incident. However, the topic was still a sore one amongst the guards when the members of the guards weren't celebrating the badassness of Graham's vicious display of mercy. After a moment, my younger kids were still distracted, but everyone else save for Graham was looking to Daniel when I said at length, "The situation was complicated, Daniel. In the end, the violence was stopped, and the community will ensure that man gets the help he needs." The missionary looked around the table, still not even appearing to notice Graham, and maybe he took my subdued reaction as a sign of agreement, since he then added in a nearly lecturing tone, "I know that's not the message we're sending to those who come to our gates. Don't start anything, or someone will batter you into oblivion and shoot your ears off. Still, I wonder what the refugees out there will take home with them." Another dead silence ensued as Daniel's gaze went around the table. I saw the eyes of my wife go to Daniel with an expression that said, "Let's not talk about this anymore. The children don't need to hear about that either." I was about to vocalize what my wife said with her face, but then I saw the wrapped head of Graham slowly turn to Daniel. When Daniel saw this, a brief look of shock appeared on his face when the words,
"If you have something to say to me, you should say it to me directly, Daniel,"
came slowly, sternly, and politely out from behind the bandages like verbal knives. Daniel's face colored. Hannah looked up from her comic below the table, and the eyes of everyone else went to Graham, not shocked, just taken aback by the thought of that statue finally speaking. The eyes of Graham were dull between the wrappings and locked onto the face of Daniel, who shifted in his chair uncomfortably to break the eye contact. Daniel's face colored further as the moment went on, and perhaps he felt he was caught in the act of something he felt he could get away with. Daniel straightened himself up further, collected his composure, and returned his gaze to Graham as he said, full of seemingly genuine remorse, "I'm sorry for not speaking about or to you directly, Mr. Graham." The wrapped statue nodded cordially in acknowledgement of the apology and a sign of forgiveness while the eyes remained on Daniel, incapable of showing almost any emotion despite the wrappings. At the gesture, Daniel added in a voice full of humility and serious resolution, "I truly am glad that you have returned to us, and more importantly, to Christ. I almost wept for joy when I received the letter speaking of your arrival." Graham's head lowered slightly, looking either ashamed or attempting to conceal some other emotion. And Daniel concluded his opinion on Graham's return with consideration of the past and thoughts of the future. "I'm just worried how things like that will reflect on how the tribes of the wilderness view us." He paused. "What I heard happened in the market, that was an injustice to you, no question. But what happened there also shows me that your past of war and all that is still close behind you. I don't think I'm alone in feeling that way. And I know things like that don't just disappear. They affect you, and they'll show even after you're born anew." Everyone at the table was silent for a long moment after that, and I think even the kids understood what Daniel laid forth. He was right, he wasn't alone in thinking that way. Graham's future in the community was still undecided, and it wasn't known what that future would look like. But no matter how Daniel, me, or any other new Canaanite felt about what happened in the market that day, they all felt. Even if they wouldn't admit it out loud, the conclusion I had arrived at, and the one Graham would speak after the silence ended. Graham raised his head back upright to meet the gaze of Daniel and said,
"But it's how the thing that follows me is used that defines me. As long as my eyes remain on him, I will remain a mere tool in what happens."
Chapter 17. Communion with Friends, Part 2. The evening went on, and shortly after Daniel and Graham's moment, my wife allowed the kids to be excused from the table. Hannah and Joseph left for their room, Joseph looping around the table just to have a reason to touch the burned man on the shoulder accidentally as he passed. I would have reprimanded the boy, but he was gone and annoying Hannah in the other room before I could say anything, and Graham appeared to not even notice despite his severely sensitive skin beneath the wrapping. Michelle followed her brother and sister into the other room to ensure they got changed over for bed, but returned shortly after since she considered herself already an adult. The tense little moment between Graham and Daniel regarding the dead horses tribe and the incident in the market seemed to allow Graham into more of the conversation. As the evening resumed, the conversations were taken from one to another, and Graham was still mostly silent, but much more involved than he had been. There was another tense moment when the conversation went into the kinds of threats in the wilderness to us and our allies. When that started, I began wishing that Michelle and even my wife had gone with the kids since I was the one doing most of the talking, and preferred not to discuss details of my job when my family was around. Because of that, my wife and eldest daughter got a front row seat for the detailed version of what I told them happened on the expedition where I brought back the outlaw Tom Cade. I gave this account with consideration to Graham, but Daniel and I got into a polite but heated moment after I gave my opinion about what should happen with Cade and how I felt the temple sect and elders would be too lenient in the end. Daniel especially got somewhat flustered when I said the elders didn't understand the reality of the dangers out in the wastes. I felt as though the elders were becoming increasingly appeasing with our enemies and trying to peacefully deal with especially violent enemies who didn't know what peace meant. Daniel reminded me of our obligation to follow what the word says, and spoke of times in the community's past where similar enemies had come around by those peaceful means I was denigrating. Daniel acknowledged my position, and argued against my view of the elders' policy of tolerance by pointing out other instances in recent years where they promoted force. It was hard for Daniel and I to agree on things like this, and not resort to statements like "you don't see the kinds of things the Guard does," because Daniel had in fact seen it all. That was actually one of the reasons I liked him so much. Similar to Mr. Mathers and I, Daniel had been all over the wilderness. Daniel had seen the kinds of violence and terror out there that makes men like me decide to join the Guard. But he saw that kind of thing, and decided he was willing to go out there armed with a Bible in one hand and sidearm in the other, rather than an automatic weapon in both hands, than a Bible in his pack. Mr. Mathers sat somewhere in the middle. Even though Mr. Mathers chose to follow the path into the temple sect, he remained one of the very select few in that part of the community to take more of the opinions of the guards than those he served under. It still puzzled me how Daniel and the other career missionaries like him could see all manner of horrors out there and still believe that the elders weren't at least partially blinded by being safe in our town for so many years. At one point in our discussion, Daniel spoke to Mr. Mathers for backup on the point he was making, only to feel slightly betrayed when Mr. Mathers said he felt I was in the right. The elders' constant bickering was a problem, and although I agreed that the spiritually correct solution they landed on was best in particular cases, Their policy did almost nothing to account for the moment and prevent things like the massacre at Dell Station in '71. He argued that their fighting wasn't the point, and that the spirit would act for the moment amongst those in the situation. After laying this out, Daniel was surprised when he got support from Graham, who'd been rather silent in this particular discussion. Strange as it was Graham who pointed out that the actions amongst those participating in the events of discussion usually ended up doing what the elders concluded was the best course of action. Then that raised my point again of, so what's the point of all the arguing between the elders? My wife and Michelle were about as lost as whoever might be reading this, but we all agreed to disagree before the conversation could go in another loop about the same things. After that, it was late, and I believe Michelle had mentally checked out. Being too exhausted from hearing so much about community direction and elder vision, she decided to stand up and clear the table. By this point in the evening, even my wife was propping her head on her hand, only sticking around out of a host's responsibility to see all the guests depart. The conversation was still winding down, and when Michelle was done clearing the table, she thanked Daniel one more time for such a lovely prayer before the dinner, then kissed her mom goodnight, and me as well, before she finally left for her room. Once Michelle had left, my poor wife shook herself awake and excused herself from the table, saying she would be back, but was just going to change over for bed. I felt as though the evening was about over as well, and was going to begin the conclusion of the evening with a customary yawn, and it's getting late, but this was wonderful. We should do it again soon, but that was prevented when the door to my wife and I's room shut. Mr. Mathers turned his head to Mr. Graham, asking something he clearly wanted to this whole night. Mr. Graham, if you don't mind my asking, what do you know about the state of NCR these days? The question was unexpected by everyone, Graham probably most of all. Still, the question was asked politely, and almost as if Mr. Mathers didn't even care about the answer. The head of Graham turned, and he scrutinized the face of the asker for a moment, perhaps wondering if the question was some kind of insult. I was the only one at the table who knew of Mr. Mathers' affiliation before he came to Christ, so even Daniel looked puzzled by the question. Graham saw the seriousness in the face of Mr. Mathers, understood it wasn't some kind of personal attack towards him, and after a moment said at length,
"I'm not entirely sure what you mean."
Mr. Mathers explained, partially subdued from realizing how the question may have sounded to a man who suffered his current state, partially due to NCR's victory over him. That realization still didn't stop him from asking what was on his mind, perhaps even for weeks, as he went on with a new hint of stern curiosity. "The dam, I mean." He paused, Graham stayed silent, and the deacon resumed. "I know you probably don't know anything about me, but I have a personal relationship with NCR, one that I still don't think I can escape despite being here for so many years. I just want to know, what kind of damage was done to them when you and the Legion?" He almost couldn't finish his question, the last word smothered in guilt for even asking. Attacked. The only sound was the muffled noise of the kids playing through their closed door and the sound of Michelle and my wife opening drawers to change for bed. Even Daniel sat there silent with a new look on his face as he faced Mr. Mathers, probably wondering why his friend in the temple sect asked the question he did. I was partially curious as well, though I knew it had to have stemmed from his prior affiliation with NCR. The eyes went to Graham again when he began speaking. Starting slowly, Graham said,
"There was much damage. Damage to my forces, and damage to NCR without question, not even counting the damage to my own self. I don't see how the particulars of the Battle of Hoover Dam that far south could be of interest to you or to New Canaan exactly. There isn't much that I know for certain about numbers and statistics. I was imprisoned nearly 4 months after the battle, and before being reduced to my current state. But if it helps satisfy your curiosity, I can only tell you I saw the corpse piles atop the dam as I waited for Caesar's arrival. I saw the smoke of the battle as it happened, the bodies falling, and the road across the dam painted red by the blood of so many killed men. I waited and waited, and the bodies were stacked when NCR moved back in to occupy the bridge over the Colorado. The stacks of Legion Red and NCR Brown appeared equally high, but maybe more in number on the red side, hundreds on both sides. In the end, the specifics don't matter when the result was the same. NCR reoccupied the dam, and I got what was already a long time coming."
Graham paused, then after another moment asked,
"Does that satisfy?"
The deacon looked away and thought for a while as Daniel and I stayed quiet. Mr. Mathers took all that in and began to slowly nod his head as he stared at the table's centerpiece, before saying in that almost embarrassed tone, "Yes, it does. Thanks for that, Mr. Graham." Mr. Graham sat motionless and staring at the deacon, looking like he was still trying to discern the motive of the original question. At last, the burned man nodded, like he'd done at Daniel's embarrassment earlier, and the deacon had recovered himself enough to speak again. He looked to all of us, including Graham, as he sought to explain himself a little better. I'm only interested because I follow what happens amongst the missionaries, scouts, and New Canaan protected caravans in the far western wilderness. I knew this to be true, and I believe Daniel did as well, even if Graham was still ignorant. I also knew that he left out the part where he would have explained his interest also included how many of his former brothers in the Rangers he could pray for. I believe he would have mentioned that if he were in perhaps different company. Either way, Mr. Mathers went on, I've also heard in rumor and seen in reports that NCR Rangers have been clearing out of the region for months. Word has it they're getting called away from the southwestern parts of Utah, where those groups I mentioned typically go to. I wonder what that means for the tribes out there, since the war between the Whitelegs and 80s is heating up down that way. NCR prospectors and many rangers are no real friends of the tribes we work with down south, and I don't know what the situation will look like if NCR is consolidating further south in the Mojave.
Most likely,
said Graham flatly before elaborating on his response.
I can almost assure you that NCR is vacating from the southwest Utah area thanks to me.
I wasn't blaming you, said Mr. Mathers, not quite hearing the emotionless or non-accusatory tone Graham was speaking in. Graham went right along.
I understand. But yes, it's because of me. I know not how close a friend NCR has been with New Canaan, or the tribes of that region bordering the Mojave in recent years. But I've already spoken to Constable Hanshaw and told him that I fully intend to assist in any part of the wilderness that may have been affected, directly by my actions with the Legion.
All at once, everyone at the table's eyes grew wide as we all asked, "What?" in near unison. Graham froze, and I believe he would have raised his eyebrows if they were still around or weren't covered by the bandages. After a short moment, I asked the man calmly and coolly, "What does that mean? Are you going to be working for the Guard?" Daniel and Mr. Mathers were nodding their heads like they too were deathly curious about the answer. Graham looked to all of us and resumed slowly, without change in pitch or tone.
Perhaps in time. It was pretty clear that the constable and the elders want me to stay concealed in town for a long time. There is understandably still great fear about who will come looking for me in the coming weeks or months. But eventually, God willing, there will come a time when I'm able to return what you and New Canaan have already done for me. I don't know what that looks like yet, or when that will be, but I know that God saved me for a reason, and I owe it to him and all of you to act upon that reason, since I can't imagine it being anything other than the opportunity to rectify the sins of my past. If my presence here is putting the community in any danger, the constable says I have a duty to help defend it, and that something within my soul that followed me out of the canyon says I have the ability.
Graham's head turned to Daniel at that last part. The room sat silent a few seconds, and the sound of my bedroom door interrupted the silence as my wife returned to us in her sleepwear. She took her place at the table, read the strange silence amongst us men, and joined in the silence before Graham's head turned back to me.
But first things first, I'm told I must wait for some quarters to be arranged for me somewhere in town.
Turning to my wife.
And thank you for taking me in, ma'am. I'll try to be as convenient a guest as possible.
For the first time since his arrival in our home that afternoon, my wife smiled genuinely at Mr. Graham, and I was left with a lot to think about. For whatever reason, it had just occurred to me in that moment that this man was here to stay with us, in our house. Daniel and Mr. Mathers stood with yawns, looked at the clock above the hallway, and saw how late it was. They gave their farewells. Me, my wife, and Mr. Graham stood as well, and my wife and I embraced the men, giving the customary, "We'll do this again soon," and walked them out, while I took a long look at the small stack of sheets and blankets atop the couch where Graham was going to sleep. I respected Graham, but I still didn't quite know what I thought of his display in the market that granted him entry into New Canaan proper, and I thought of everything that was said over dinner. I wondered how Daniel took his meeting with the man he'd only heard about in letters and stories throughout his youth. I wondered what exactly Mr. Mathers was worried or thinking about at news of his former brothers and the Rangers getting pulled out of the Utah wilderness to fight a war in the Mojave. The relationship between Graham and the two men of the Temple sect would be brought up again. But they both had opinions and prejudices when it came to our returned brother. One of the men even had a direct interaction with the same man before his literal baptism by fire. But more on that later. For now, though, the evening was over. Only a few people in New Canaan had even heard about the elders' decision to bring Joshua Graham inside the walls of their home. And what he would do within the community was still uncertain, while his future role was at least alluded to this night. Still, it was time for bed. My friends in the Temple sect were on their way to their respective domiciles under the street lamps. I was in bed with my wife, and the one-time most dangerous man in all of the Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah wastelands was laying my guest sheets out on my couch. Chapter 18. A Child's Innocence. For me, the next morning would be just like the normal routine. I'd awake early, help my wife get the kids fed, and help her clean them up before the clock turned 5:40. I'd set out to the guard barracks, conduct my usual role at the morning muster, deliver any news of the day, and set off with my men to man our posts for the day. Lately, it had been mostly gate stations and market patrols or assignment to the watchtowers, but part of our shifts on the ground level was dedicated to protecting the charity stations. The constable had learned from the incident with Graham, and so an extra layer of protection was added around our charity workers since the refugee situation was still so chaotic. A few days later, Mr. Mathers' construction project would be completed, and the refugees would be sent there to have their needs met or persons tended to. Because of this, and because of the nature of my job, I didn't have a whole lot to say about what it was like to live with Joshua Graham on my couch. When word eventually got out about what the elders decided to do with Graham, it wasn't long before the question was asked, well, where's he staying in the meantime? I don't think it's outside the realm of probability that it was likely Hanshaw's personal runner contingent that started to tell people where they were tasked with taking the burned man's possessions after he was released from the cell. After that, it may not be any surprise that the guardsmen of my detachment and others were constantly hounding me about what it was like to live with him. For reasons I just told, I didn't have much to say. This left the guardsmen I worked beside to speculate. It was actually so irritating, Nathan in particular, that I decided it was about time I checked in with the other half of my detachment for a few days. Unfortunately, the men under my other squad leader, Chance Rhines, were little better than the ones under John Langdon, the reader is more familiar with. Not only were the men under Rhines just as interested in Graham as the men of my other squad, but I hadn't spent enough time with them in the past month to keep afloat in their flood of other questions for me. Still, getting some time with them was long overdue, and although I would return to the company of Langdon's squad a week or two after Graham had moved out, it was a long couple days as the memory of Graham's incident in the market was still very fresh amongst everyone in the guard. Some of my brothers and sisters in the community would later tell me how they thought it odd to hear that Graham was staying with me and my family. Most of them were more focused on how unorthodox it was to leave a man at home alone with another man's wife. Not that people were speculating about affairs and the like, it was just a custom of our community to never have a man alone under the same roof as 1, 2, or even 3 women of the community, unless he was related to them. I found it odd that their fixation was on that for the most part, and not the fact of who he once was, or why he was brought into the community proper. He was only our guest for about 4 days, but from everything I heard from my wife, she was almost never there during the day. Apparently, he wasn't either. I mentioned previously that my wife was, for the most part, a housewife. However, being a housewife in the community rarely meant being at home. In order to run a household, she was taken all over town, going to fetch water, food for meals, buying and selling clothes, tools, and goods for the house. She retrieved the kids once school let out, helped them with their school work, escorted them to their activities or children's groups, took them shopping for things they needed, etc. None of this is even mentioning the amount of volunteer work she did for missions coordination, the sewing she did with her women's group, charity assignment, the evening support and Bible studies on certain days, etc. The point being that she was a busy woman, and even when she was home, she was cleaning, doing laundry, preparing meals, tending the garden, or preparing to run one of her errands. In the end, I too was curious about what our house guest was like that first evening, but after being reminded of all she had to do, she told me that she didn't even believe he was home. My wife mentioned how Mr. Graham had left maybe 30 minutes after I did, and only saw him around noon before she caught sight of him entering the house, while she was tending our garden in the back, only for him to leave out the front again a moment later. He was there for dinner and remained very silent when he wasn't answering Joseph, and later Hannah's barrage of questions. It was like that every day he was with us. Every morning I saw Graham asleep on the couch when my wife and I made breakfast for the kids. He joined us at the table each time, sometimes eating his own food. Then, I'd see him in the evening when I returned from the shift. I got to see him Saturday for a little longer since Saturday was the Sabbath for our detachment, but I was kept busy with the Guard's Bible studies in the evening and time with my wife during the day. Graham was essentially a mystery the whole time he lived with us, and why he left or what he did during the days was a mystery to me, my wife, and pretty much everyone who knew of the short-term housing arrangement. That was except for one person. The person who knew more about our guests' first days in the community and time spent living with us was actually my son Joseph. I learned all of this sometime later, but my 7-year-old son was given an assignment by his teacher the day before Mr. Graham showed up at our house to keep a diary for 5 days. The goal of the assignment was pretty standard. Every child of the community learned to read and write at a young age, and this particular exercise was given with the reasoning that kids should know how to keep journals. This was important, even at a young age, because every trade or position in the community was required to keep them or make logs no matter the station. Whether that child would grow up and become a career missionary, a member of the Guard, or even a barber or bishop, journals were a very regular part of our community, and largely how our history was kept so well in places like the archives. Of course, lessons like these would continue, and even Michelle would keep similar ones in mission prep school even during this time. But Joseph's teacher gave his class this assignment with instruction to write about whatever they did or whatever they felt like writing about for those 5 days. Grammar and spelling was lenient because he and his classmates were 7 at the time, but it was because of my son and his parents guessed that me, my wife, and his teacher got a very unique perspective on this short period in Joshua Graham's life. With only minimal editing in order to compensate for a 7-year-old's spelling, poor handwriting, and grammatical choices, I think it's best to describe this whole thing in my son Joseph's own words, given what I could decipher. Joseph's homework. November 15th, 2277. Today was dumb, but tonight was really fun. I hated how I have to write for Mrs. Pryor's class. I told her yesterday that I didn't know what to write about when she told me our homework. Ronnie and Caleb and Tom made fun of me on the way home, and I told them they were mad because they didn't know what to write about too. I was sad and even sadder because they got their journals first, and so I had to get the pink one. Debbie and Rose made fun of me for that too, but it was better when Michelle walked me the rest of the way home. I asked her why Mom wasn't picking me up, and I didn't feel better when we got Hannah too. But it was better when Michelle said I can have one of her books so that Caleb won't make fun of me for the pink one anymore. Then I asked if Michelle can ask Mom if I can walk home with Ronnie and Caleb tomorrow, and she said she would, because whenever I ask they say no, and Mom always listens to Michelle. That made me feel better, but I was still sad, and I felt better when I got home because I know what to write about. Dad came home from work early with a friend, and he was going to make Ronnie and Caleb sad because he got to come to my family instead of Ronnie or Caleb's. Dad said that Mr. Joshua Graham was going to stay with us for days, and that was so cool. He had dinner with my family, and Dad was quiet, but me and Hannah had fun. Mr. Mathers and Mr. Daniel was there too, and Mr. Graham said I can call him Joshua, and the dinner was fun. Michelle was really weird and had that face she made when she talks to Isaiah, or Evan, when Evan was around. Girls are weird, but Joshua was quiet, and he sounded like he hurt when he eats, but he told me that I'm faster than Caleb when I showed him how fast I can run, and said at dinner that we can be best friends when he's feeling better. Ronnie will be mad that I'm friends with Joshua first, and that he stayed at our house and not his when I tell him tomorrow. Mr. Graham never made a promise to be best friends with Joseph at the dinner table, nor agreed that Joseph was faster at running than Caleb. Some of this is merely Joseph's imaginings, although I have no way of verifying what he describes of the next days, since I was busy with my duties. November 16th. Today I woke up Dad and Mom first because I couldn't sleep. Hannah couldn't too, and I wanted to see Joshua. Dad and Mom left him to sleep on the couch as they made breakfast, and I got to watch him. It looked like it hurt even when he slept, and I dared Hannah to look under his bandage while he sleeps. She didn't want to and ran away, and I looked at him and his eyes were open, and I can't tell if he could see me next to him, so I asked him. He said he could, and I asked him if he was always going to be like this. He asked what time it was, and I told him it was almost breakfast time, and he didn't say anything else until I asked if what Ronnie and Debbie said about him was true. He didn't know what I meant, and I asked if he shot a man in the market, and he said yes, but I don't want to tell Ronnie that he didn't shoot the bandit dead because I don't want to give Ronnie 2 chocolates. I asked if he was going to go with my dad to the Guard today because I think he will be good at it, and he said no, but can't tell what he's going to do today. I said he should go temple because he liked it so much the last time, and he remembered I went with him that one night. Then Dad and Mom came in the room and told me to stop bothering Joshua. I wasn't bothering him, and he said so too, but I was hungry and went to the table to eat. At school we worked on our diaries and learned more math after lunch. I don't like school because it makes me feel dumb, but Mrs. Pryor and Mom and Michelle say I'm good at it, but Hannah always calls me dumb. School was bad, and I was mad because of math, but I remembered Michelle told Mom that I can walk home today, and Ronnie and Caleb couldn't make fun of me anymore because I don't have a pink diary anymore, and they were mad because I told them about Joshua staying with us and how much friends we are. After school was over at 2:30, Caleb and Ronnie asked me all about Joshua, and I couldn't think of any more to make up, so Caleb asked if we could follow him. I would get in trouble for not coming home, but Mom knows I have kids group at 5, and I can say that I stayed at Ronnie's to work on homework, so we went. None of us knew where Graham was, but I thought he would be at home when we saw him walk past the community garden by the school in Town Square. He was going to the trades by the north side, and we went to follow him. I could prove I would be a better spy than Caleb. We followed him 2 streets, till he entered the goods store, and we hid in the alley, and I don't think he saw us. He left going to East Side, and there was no one else around, so Ronnie kept watch when Caleb and me went in the store. I asked Mr. Eastman what Joshua bought, and he said he bought 2 strips of jerky and a bottle of water and 3 chocolates for us. I hit Caleb because I knew it was his sneeze that gave us away, and he wanted to hit me back but was happy about the chocolate. We tried to sneak after him again, and I think we were better this time because he didn't say anything when we followed him to the North End workstation where he made ammo by himself for 30 minutes. He left something in the collection bucket and then went to a community fire to toast meat and stitch hides for another 30 minutes. Once he was done, he didn't see us when we followed him more. Now there were people leaving their jobs, and the streets were busy, but everyone pretended like he wasn't there, but he didn't seem to mind. We wanted to see where he went before we had to go to kids group, so we followed him to the square, and he went up to the temple but didn't go inside because he went around side and opened the gate to the prayer garden. We didn't know why he was there, so we looked over the wall and he was reading the Bible on a bench in a group of the trees. Ronnie and Caleb and me decided to go here tomorrow, and we went to the kids group to play games and learn about David. When I was at home, Mom was mad at me for not coming home after school, but she was nice again when I told her again what Michelle said, and I asked if I could spend time with my friends after school again, and she said yes if I do my homework. Then I saw him at dinner, and I thanked him for the candy, and he ate his own food at the table with me, Michelle, Hannah, Mom, and Dad. Then I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep, and I forgot to make my diary, so I did that, and was done before I was too tired. Joseph clearly liked writing, but it was evident just from this entry that he only really liked writing about what he was interested in. There was much I had to do editing-wise just to make the above legible and make sense since he was 7 at the time, but the kid impressed me. Even more interesting was the subject matter, since with it I got to get an insight into the character of Joshua beyond the events I witnessed and beyond his reputation. In the next entry, Joseph woke Mr. Graham up in a way almost identical to the way he did in the previous entry, and then spent a lot more time talking about how much he hated his morning baths on these days, and what happened at school than he did previously. After this, his journal starts when he and his friends decided they'd seek out Graham again. November 16. Many words about waking up Graham, how much he hates baths outside, speculation about why his mom gets frustrated with him on bath days, everything that happened at school, etc. Ronnie and me saw Joshua make more ammo after school and help Mr. Vickers with the wood he was cutting. I think he was going to the fire again when he was done, so me and Ronnie and Caleb went to the prayer garden to wait in the bushes for him to see what he was doing. I like the prayer garden even if it is boring if I am in it too long. It's really pretty though. I like all the plants since there aren't many green or flowers plants anywhere else in town. I also like reading all the prayers pinned to the cross in the middle of the garden, and I sometimes think to pray for them too when I pray before bed, but sometimes I forget. Me and Caleb and Ronnie hid in the bushes behind the bench he was sitting yesterday, and we got real quiet when we saw him come through the gate. He didn't see us, and we were quiet as a mouse, and we watched him write on a paper, then pin the paper to the cross, then sit on the bench and open his Bible. I was scared because he was so close, and Caleb wished he brought his jacket because it was cold, but he was quiet because he didn't want to be seen. I was scared too, and Joshua read on that bench for a long time before he said loudly, "I know you've been watching me. You can come out, boys." I hit Ronnie because I know it was him who made a sound, but he was too stiff and we came out. Joshua knew me and we stood in front of him. Caleb and Ronnie said sorry, but Joshua looked nice and closed his Bible and asked if we wanted to talk to him. I said yes, and Ronnie and Caleb were still sad. I asked him why he was making ammo, and he said he wanted to hunt later, or trade. Then I asked him if he was feeling better, and he said he was getting used to the pain. Then Caleb asked what Joshua was reading, and he said he was reading from Acts when Saul became Paul. I didn't know Acts too good, and he said he would answer questions, but Ronnie asked him if his dad was right, when his dad said he used to be a very evil man. Ronnie's question looked like it made him sad, and I hit him, and Joshua said not to do that, and I said sorry. I asked if that was why my dad didn't talk about him, and if that is why people avoid him in the street, and he said it was, but he's trying to be better. He said only time, and God will fix that, and Caleb said his dad talks about him all the time. Caleb's dad is my dad's guard friend, and I like Mr. Langdon, but I told Joshua that my dad's cooler than Caleb's dad because my dad is his dad's boss. It goes on like this for a while. The boys ask Mr. Graham all manner of questions, occasionally going off on tangents because of their own boyhood minds. It really was something else to read this later and see how much interest and kindness they had in a man who had been a topic of taboo at their family's dinner tables for so many years until a few short weeks ago. While their parents avoided him or busied themselves with their daily lives, it was nice to hear that these kids had such an innocent curiosity about him as word gradually spread that he was here to stay, and within the walls. The entire entry ended without much else when Joseph writes, "Then it was late and Mom and Dad were going to be mad at me for being late, and Caleb and Ronnie were going to get in trouble too because there was no kids group tonight. Joshua said he would walk us home, and Ronnie's parents were glad he was okay, but he got in trouble because he was home so late, but thanked Joshua for taking him home. Caleb's dad was okay because he was off when my dad was, and shake Joshua's hand, and Joshua took me home too in time for dinner." There were 2 more entries, but the Saturday with my wife was spent shopping with her, relaxing in the East End's community garden, and we even spent a few hours at the library before going to our groups for the evening. It wasn't the most romantic day, but we got some stuff done. My wife learned some new recipes for the house, and I brushed up on my knowledge of spirit and self before finishing off the night with one of the guard's study groups. Michelle and Hannah said that Graham was hardly there that Saturday, but the boy didn't have much to write about other than the ways that he tormented his sisters while my wife and I were out. Although in the entry for that Saturday, he did say he assumed Joshua was going about his strange business across town and hounded his sisters to stalk the man with him to little avail. Joseph went to an all-Sunday event with his class and kids group that Sunday, and talked about that in his diary, but there was something I noticed throughout Sunday that I couldn't quite place until I read Joseph's entries. The Friday that Graham escorted Joseph and his friends home was the night I noticed our house guest take on a new tone. He still remained largely silent, and a man of few words in the mornings or at the table, but over those nights he became much more alive. He wouldn't be accepted wholly by the community for still a while yet, but the sounds of laughter and amount he talked to us only increased if ever so slightly, and no matter how painful it was for him. Mr. Graham's incident in the market was still something only the members of the guard and the temple really knew about beyond rumor, but perhaps that was best. What he had done and what he had contained inside of him seemed to matter little when he was enjoying dinner at our table, exciting the children, and only spoke in the politest of words. It came as something of a shock when I got off my shift that Sunday, returned home when my family was still with their groups, and saw the note on the folded-up stack of bedding atop my couch saying, "Thank you for you and your family's acceptance of me into your home. I hope I was not too much of a burden, and I look forward to seeing you all again real soon. If needed, You can find me at my new dwelling the elders assigned for me. Northwest Quadrant, QD, Common Housing, Building BLDG, 2, Unit 8. I knew the place. It was an old single-story motel restored over the years, only a stone's throw from the North Fields, and on the opposite side of the town from the barracks. Almost a 20-minute walk straight north from my home. It was a building for unmarried men of the New Canaan population. I knew they weren't the nicest dwellings, but it was nicer than the shack he was living in outside the walls. The common houses like that for men or women were typically considered more like temporary housings for those who were going to get married or were preparing to take lodging with a trade like the Guard or Temple that had their own housing groups. Still, perhaps it was best that he was going to be amongst the ranks of the general unmarried population, but it got me thinking, what is his permanent place in the community going to look like, and when will that be? Chapters 19 through 21 of the Fallout fanfiction work, Paul's Letter to Rome. Narrated by Hannah Young, daughter of Lieutenant Paul Young, of the New Canaan Guard, 2277. Chapter 19, Booted from Paradise, Part 1. Around 2 weeks later. It was early December, and the preparatory works for the holy season began only 1 week previously. Christmas was fast approaching, and as the winds and nights got colder, there was much to do. Christmas time in my home was particularly wonderful, and although something happened in the nuclear holocaust of 2077 to disturb the weather patterns I'd read about, it was especially cold, and we even experienced a few days of light snowfall. The town was alive and comfortable as families and groups and trades within the walls prepared for the season by getting done with their work and signing up for work groups or charity events special for the Christmas season. The smoke from chimneys poured into the air above the town all day and all night, and the work went on. Every day, and especially days my detachment was in the towers, we'd see the kids would leave school, and trades would end their shifts only to fill the streets and begin happily putting up decorations throughout town. Lights were strung up along the street lamps. Nativity scenes would show up in every community garden. The construction groups would decorate the temple. The storefront of every shop and trade building would be strewn in lights, and all the while the soft sounds of New Canaanites caroling as they worked would come to us up in the gate towers. The market and world outside the walls were a strange contrast. Every day, groups of refugees were coming to us, and although the charity groups and missions coordination were working overtime, the refugee crisis was becoming more of a routine than anything. The way we've been handling it was working well enough, and many New Canaanites thanked Mr. Mathers for his renovation project a couple of months back, while he reminded them to thank God. Because of his and his workers' job at the former ranch of our former Bishop Judah Black, we now had a completely dedicated station for managing the refugee crisis. Although the work was continuous, the missionary and charity groups and guardsmen assigned to that refugee town had their work cut out for them. At this time, the refugee handling station truly was more like a separate town. Perhaps nearly 200 or more refugees occupied the area with several dozen tents, and missionaries were sent out all the time, leading them to new homes in the wilderness, only for new groups to replace them. Although the groups were mostly from the east, we still received them from all over, and the missions teams were doing their sometimes thankless work, ignited by the spirit of the holy season, shown in the glow behind the walls. As the sky got dark, the days were slow for the most part at the start. Every few days, my detachment was sent to the refugee town where we helped keep order, even if it seemed like many days we weren't even needed. Perhaps the incident with Graham at the start of the crisis still resonated amongst the refugee population. Perhaps it was because of the increasing cold of the season. Or perhaps it was because of the refugees' quarantine from those who'd seek to exploit the charity. Either way, the work with the refugees was peaceful for the most part. And still, the work went on. Although the market was free from much of the general refugee traffic, business in the markets went on fairly normally with traders from all over the wilderness and further. Many who came to the markets were from lands beyond the wilderness, and many still were here from the surrounding wastes. While many traders enjoyed having a steady customer base with the population of New Canaan and the refugees, Much of the business was done with us and their fellow tradesmen, since so many of the refugees didn't have much other than the clothes on their backs. Still, the weather got colder, and due to wars in the east between the tribes and Legion, and war in the west between the White Legs and 80s, many of the traders found it best to stay put for a while in the safety of New Canaan's direct vicinity. By the start of the first week in December, all of the temporary lodging shacks in and around the market were occupied by traders and wasters, and it was shortly after this that the guards' patrols of the market grounds began to come upon an issue we had to deal with nearly every cold season. It turns out that those traders who decide to lodge under our protection seem to forget how weird they think we are and are surprised when they learn they have to play by our rules when under our protection. A lot of traders, especially those from lands beyond the wilderness, like NCR lands in the west, or settlements up north, come to us with open minds, even if they aren't very willing to participate in the real reason our community is around. No matter the season, traders from outside begin to grumble when they learn they can't get a stiff drink or alcohol from New Canaan-owned businesses in the market, like the Trinity Inn. Their frustration becomes even more so when they realize our community won't tolerate prostitution either, and decide they'd keep a lid on it, knowing they could get their vices satisfied to abundance after a very short stay at New Canaan. Some come to terms with it, and sometimes even attend the little scrap-built chapel outside the walls to see if the God of Abraham and New Canaan can help them cope with the lack of what they can't get in our territory. Those traders or wasters who remain uninterested in the Lord seek to subvert our rules and then turn to their own stocks of alcohol, or sometimes even drugs while they are with us. This particular is true no matter the season. We guardsmen don't particularly mind if traders sell one another alcohol or drink their own stocks, and so long as they don't attempt to sell to New Canaanites in the market, they remain free to do as they wish, while drug or chem use is strictly forbidden while in public. That isn't to say drug and chem use doesn't happen when we're looking the other way. But while drug use and distribution normally result in expulsion or confinement to a cell till the drugs are gone, the use of alcohol is dealt with in a far more lenient manner. Overall, the men of the guard typically try not to look down on those who partake in their vices, provided they aren't causing too much of a disturbance because of it. In fact, I've seen a waster stumble out of his tent or rented shack with a bottle in his hands, only for a guardsman to stop him and ask to pray for him many times. That's usually as far as it goes regarding alcohol, accompanied by the guardsman gently telling them something along the lines of, "You don't need that." Funnily enough, drunk people are sometimes the most interested and willing to listen to what the men in black police vests and caps with crosses on them have to say about Jesus Christ. I only bring all that up because in the second week of December, while New Canaan was still preparing for Christmas, the men of my detachment were sent to put an end to something that culminates every season, when the rented lodgings are full, and the traders decide they don't want to put up with our regulations for more than a week. Usually, we don't care what the wastelanders or ambitious businessmen from beyond the wilderness decide to sell outside the markets. But the enterprise was a bit too close to us for comfort, and even more problematic because of the name they decided to call it. Not only this, but I think the operation I will go on to explain was something of a turning point. I believe it was after this operation and this Christmas season that formally marked the start of all the problems I've laid forth since the beginning, finally accumulating enough to start showing in the new year. A sort of calm before the storm, if you will. "So, what's the name of this place?" asked Nathan idly, looking at the dark wastes around us. All to our east and south was darkness, while the lights of the lanterns across the market and bright Christmas lights from the town proper illuminated the world behind us. Our path, the caravan path south from the gates to our home, was still faintly lit by the dim glow of lanterns and campfires along the trail, as the only other source of light in this darkness was the small collection of fires, and dim neon southwest off the trail on our right. "You forget to read the signs, or what?" asked Carl Northrup, adjusting the shoulder straps of his small pack, himself looking much wider than he normally was in that big padded jacket made from the scraps of probably 20 other jackets. We all look at the sign up ahead, sitting between two dim lanterns, and reflecting the glow of a nearby fire, keeping 6 wasters and refugees warm. The sign was nearly identical to every 5th sign we passed since leaving the market grounds and reading, "Come to Adam and Eve's Pleasure Garden." And below that, "Next right green sign." We ignored the group of refugee men talking loudly in their tribal dialect, following us in the same direction. But we decided to turn off the path before reaching the green sign with lanterns beside it reading, "Paradise 1 mile this way." Paradise would have been hilarious if the whole energy around this little enterprise wasn't so frustrating for many reasons I'll illuminate later. Reflecting on the other signs we've read since leaving the last shacks around the market and passing the refugee town said things like, "Everything you can't find in New Canaan found this way. Come get high and drink," with an arrow pointing further south. "All sinners welcome at A and EPG." As we got closer to the destination, the group of us felt increasingly uncomfortable with every group of wasters or refugees that passed us whooping and hollering as they headed in the same direction as us. We looked and felt like idiots in our patchwork garb of jackets and pants sewn together by the seamstress groups at home and scavenged from department stores probably 100 years prior. There must have been rats in my jacket before it was pulled from the storeroom for this assignment, because every part of it was frayed and stringy and bore an awful smell before the night breeze carried most of that scent away. Still, we all looked the part, and beyond looking like any other group of wasters, we were all still concealing our .45 pistols beneath our jackets. Perhaps the only thing that could give us away was the cleanliness of our faces, except for Nathan and Ramos, who decided to smudge dirt on them before I said I didn't think that was necessary. As we turned off the caravan path and stepped onto the rugged wasteland, Ramos asked the group in general, what was the name of that mobile one they did last year around this time? I forget. He didn't forget, and John and I said as much at the exact same time. Still, Nathan took the bait, or leapt at the opportunity, asking, "You mean that restored camper unit getting led around by a team of Brahmin?" "That's it. What was that called again?" asked the youngest man in my detachment, knowing full well what he was doing. Before Nathan could utter the first syllable, I told him without any humor in my voice, "You say it and you're getting put in the night guard." The distant sounds of laughter and chatter from the groups of wasters and refugees going to and from the lighted establishment were the only things to be heard beneath the winds and the sounds of our footsteps for a long moment. Then, I contemplated once more whether or not I felt Mr. Langdon to be my second in command when he answered Mr. Ramos's question, "The pussy wagon." Mr. Langdon mouthed something to the sky. My men contained their laughter as we neared the path to the brothel of today, and then Mr. Langdon considered how I would punish him later. Carl then asked simply, "Why we gotta look like wasters if we're doing a show of force?" "This isn't the show of force," said I. "This is the 'we'll ask you kindly once more' part of this situation." "Oh, okay," said Carl, followed by John Langdon. "After this, we'll do the show of force. From there, it's up to them to decide whether or not we move on to the 'I hope you've accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior' part." Nathan chuckled, Ramos shrunk back a few paces behind, and we stepped on the path. A gaggle of drunk wasters stumbled our way looking like black silhouettes in the glow of the fires and restored neon signs behind them. The establishment sat little less than a mile straight ahead. Carl rubbed his hands to combat the cold and stole a glance toward New Canaan and all its bright Christmas wonder before saying idly, "Never came to this last year with the proprietor of the wagon. And I pray it goes no further than this," said I before John asked the group. "You boys hear what they did to Daryl from Missions Outreach yesterday?" I nodded, remembering what I heard and why I volunteered my detachment for this. Hearing Ramos give a low "uh-huh" behind me, Carl and Nathan were in the barracks at the time, and I had Ramos bring me some files for guard interviews last night. When John came to my door with the news he heard from the constable, with Nathan and Carl ignorant, Carl asked, "Daryl Fleischer, what happened?" I spoke for John. Man was sent to give New Canaan's demands. A simple "move 8 miles south and change your name" request was met with some disagreement. "Disagreement?" asked John with a shake of his head. "These scumbags did more than that. They decided to." He stopped himself at the look I gave him, and the group of wasters was too close for us to talk, although they may have been too drunk to figure out who we were regardless of what we were saying. The collection of brightly lit trailers around a wide, run-down building was a bit closer now, and the group of wasters passed us whooping and hollering with colorful bits directed at us and each other like, "Best night of my life. Ya guys'll love it, thur. My bish was hot. Why ya always pick the Uggos Clyde? Screw new Canaan. We do what we want. And I'm tellin' ya, Bill. No booze, no chems. Legion and Canaan's the same." Personally, I would have laughed at the Wastelander logic, a community that doesn't permit alcohol, prostitution, and drugs equal to Caesar's Legion, but I was a bit too focused on the task ahead at the time. Soon enough, the wasters passed, and as we neared the establishment, the quiet in my group only ended when Nathan muttered to nobody in particular, "Wish Graham was here for this," alluding to his noteworthy incident in the market a couple weeks back. Was the response from everyone, including John, while I stayed silent, not sure what to make of the statement and mutual opinion from my men. I felt myself about to ask in all honesty why he said that. However, I already knew the answer since the incident in the market was still being talked about, and before I could ask it, Carl asked me, "Hey, LT, you mentioned where he's living now, but what has he been up to?" I didn't really know the answer to that, although I did mention what he said over dinner that first night and how he might come to the ranks of the Guard at some point in the distant future. However, before I could say anything, Nathan said what all of us have at least noticed over the past week. "Guys putting up Christmas lights, remember? We saw him the other day." That was true. And it really was something else to see that burnt and wrapped man up on a ladder with the others stringing up lights around lampposts and along the trim of buildings. There was always someone holding his ladder, and he was always with the regular population as he worked. I didn't know if he was ordered to do this or just volunteered, but it certainly was strange to know that man's past, know what he did in the market, and then to see him decorating for the holiday with the rest of the new Canaan population, just before the end of our detachment's shift. At that, I thought about the days since he'd moved out of my family's home. Whenever our detachment was assigned to one of the towers, I'd think back to Joseph's diary assignment he got back a day after turning it in, and then I'd turn to look back at the town. More often than not, whenever I did, I'd see Joshua Graham wandering the streets by his lonesome while the rest of the town was with their trades or working their shops. In those first days, I remember that of the few people who walked the streets in the midday, almost all of them would go around him. Even if there were words spoken, I was always too far to hear. Even when the trades and shops and schools would let out, the same thing would occur. The streets would fill, but still, Graham would walk, going about his strange business and looking like a rock in the middle of a stream as everyone passed around him. Then I thought of the last time I'd seen him walk the town not more than 2 days ago. Sometime before we caught sight of him stringing up lights with one of the many volunteer holiday decorator groups. I remember seeing everyone he passed wave to him. Graham would wave back to every single one with his wrapped arm, even as the streets filled with the end of the day. It occurred to me how not one person would avoid him or fail to give him a wave as he passed. A stark contrast to how the populace felt about him in the immediate days after his integration into the town proper. My thoughts were broken as another group of wasters passed us drunkenly hollering at one another, and a group of tribals screamed and made wild gestures at each other in their own dialect. The establishment was closer now, and we weren't more than 150 yards from the campfire, surrounded by crowds of men beside the entryway, when I spoke the order. "Listen up, boys." I felt their wordless acknowledgement and resumed. "When we get inside, we find Lieutenant Doyley and, I think, Lieutenant Pryor, husband of Joseph's teacher, Mrs. Pryor, and see where they want us. Both of them, as well as their men, should be there now." I heard a few mumbled affirmations as the group of wasters in our rear grew slightly louder. "We're blending in, so do what you can to not draw attention to yourselves or anyone else. Engage with any women who approach you. And although I'm sure I don't need to say this, but you are not to do anything beyond casual discourse." I heard Carl push Ramos off the path, followed by the short remark, "Remember, you're saving yourself for marriage, baby boy." Ramos caught up. John chuckled. and Nathan asked strangely seriously for the question he had. Are we supposed to drink to help us fit in? Thugs might get suspicious if there are so many in there asking for water or tea. I thought about this too and went on, somewhat surprised he didn't ask the question in his usual sarcasm. I'll see what Doyle and Pryor have decided when we get there, but we're just waiting on Lieutenant Camden to show up and give us a sign to start the shutdown. I'll figure out what that sign is later, but remember our secondary task on any assignment like this. John, Nathan, and Carl made an sound, and I went on for Mr. Ramos, who's never been on an assignment like this that went as far. If you see any of our brothers or sisters inside the premises, you are to approach them discreetly, take down their names, and order them to leave without commotion. The boys were silent, allowing me to add, it doesn't happen that often, but our brothers and sisters have been discovered in places like this before, so keep eyes open and look at the younger men inside especially. We're here. At that, we were inside the glow of the 2 crowded fires beside the chain-link fence to the premises. Ignoring the laughter and talking amongst those huddled around the flames, we also ignored the terrible fight happening somewhere off to our right just beyond the glow, and proceeded onward. Usually, assignments like this were carried out by older or married members of the Guard, since the younger ones, such as Ramos, Carl, and Nathan, were more susceptible to the temptations of a brothel. However, I mentioned the Guards were short-staffed, and although it wasn't hard to muster the right amount of bodies for a task like this, it was hard to acquire the particular kinds of bodies like married ones for it. Either way, my thoughts were cut short when a bald probable caravan guard turned bouncer, thug covered in leather ammo pouches over his jacket, said, "Welcome to Adam and Eve's Pleasure Garden." We nodded. I felt the urge to throw up at the mention of such a name for a place like this, and it didn't help when the woman in an almost identical leather outfit laden in ammo bandoliers held a bowl out to us saying, "Need condoms?" Nobody has sex without one. She didn't say has sex. I extended my hand to the bowl to fit in. She retracted the thing and said, 5 caps, or 5 bullets, 9 mil up. Without a word, I pulled 5 .45 bullets out of my pocket, took the prophylactic, and the transaction was over in 2 seconds. Without slowing our pace, we continued onward toward the brick building all lit up. I briefly thought that I should have brought 9mm bullets, or 10mm, since New Canaanites were known across the Utah wilderness to use .45 almost, exclusively in our standard sidearms and submachine guns. Although the bouncer didn't seem to notice or care, the type of weapon that shoots .45 was fairly common amongst the tribes and wasters of the wilderness. Passing the welcome crew and stepping inside the compound, I think we all simultaneously realized why the constable required such a large crew for this job. It was a circus. Beyond the large white crosses painted crudely on the faces of the central building, and the sign Adam and Eve's Pleasure Garden spelled out across the top with neon letters from probably 30 different signs, what really captured me was the grounds before the building. I didn't know what happened inside the building, but I assumed that was where the bar was, because the place sat in the middle of an old trailer park. Seeing women leading men to different trailers under the dim lamps and campfires, I assumed the trailers were where the brothel services were engaged. But the lively theme and lights of the place weren't what really caught my attention after stepping inside. As we neared the building, it really shocked me at how crowded the place was. We did our best to scan the crowds for any brothers or sisters to confront and usher away, but there were far too many concealed by the darkness, despite the electric signs, campfires, and restored lampposts. Between the 2 long trailers flanking the entrance and the building, there must have been a half-dozen camp or barrel fires, each surrounded by crowds of men, many with bottles in their hands, and far more noise than we were used to. The gimmick was apparently working well for the owners. There must have been well over 100 men just between the entrance to the compound and the building alone, and the whole place appeared to be a regular den of sin, or something everyone in the wilderness knew about. Overall, the sight made me sorry that there were so many men who didn't want to find any kind of alternative to their vices while they were in New Canaan jurisdiction. However, I will admit that the entire Brahmin carcass roasting over a giant spit in front of the trailer on our left was rather impressive. The fellows in charge of that were charging for a sliver, and it smelled so good I almost stopped by for one. But we were soon stepping up to the door to the brick structure, and passing the bouncer with a nod as we stepped inside. Chapter 20. Booted from Paradise Part 2. I was apparently wrong. It appeared that the trailers weren't the only place the brothel services were carried out, if the horrendous smell that entered my nose upon entry to the establishment proper was any indication. I kept my composure, and assumed my men did too, as we shuffled past the dirty wasters and refugee men crowding the entrance before we went under a wide doorframe. Another woman bouncer told us to enjoy our stay and pointed out the bar on the far side of the large open room. Past the crowds and over the heads of the dozen completely occupied tables, I scanned the room. There were nearly as many people in here as there were outside. Dozens of wasters, refugee men, and women in dirty short mishmash dresses went to and fro or occupied all the tables. I scanned the room, my men behind me scanning as well. All the while we took in the smell of over 100 dirty bodies in a packed room. The smell of sweat, cigarette smoke, alcohol, grease, paint, and even gunpowder, all beneath the overpowering smell of sex filled our noses. Then I saw them. There at a table near the left end of the long bar was a table with 6 chairs packed around it with Lieutenant Doyle at the head and Lieutenant Pryor beside him. Beside Pryor appeared to be Duncan Schmidt, and the rest of the chairs were empty. All of us nearly unrecognizable in our wastelander garb. Doyle caught eyes with me by the entrance with my men, and made a motion with his head. I pointed out Doyle to John, and he led the boys past me towards the table before I followed in the rear. Through the crowds we went. John, Nathan, and Ramos took their seats at Doyle and Pryor's table when a group of drunk men stumbled past me. I took the opportunity to scan the room again, noticing most of the women, whether they were on the laps of men, talking in corners, or leading men to private places. Most bore the sun-touched skin and garb of women we'd seen in the refugee village around the old ranch of Judah Black. The discovery of who these prostitutes were, and how they were so many of the ones my brothers and sisters in the refugee camp tried to help, made me sad. As I looked around, I felt very strange, seeing many of the apparent refugee prostitutes were so differing in their faces. Some sat on the laps of men, laughing with the men at the tables. Some were standing in the corners with solemn faces, as crowds of men gathered around them. Some of the prostitutes were bruised and wearing fake smiles, while refugee men stood close by and scowled at the women, as if to say these prostitutes' wives or daughters were being forced into pleasing the customers. The diversity and overall sadness amongst the majority of women selling themselves had already set my mind on the immediate shutdown of this place as soon as possible. Yet there was something else that only confirmed this in my eyes when I saw a group of young girls, perhaps between 13 to 16, standing in one of the far corners wearing worried looks as even more groups of men gathered around them. I didn't know if the girls in that corner were only there while their mothers or older sisters worked, but even the possibility of those girls so young acting as prostitutes made my rage build, and I promised I'd confirm the situation myself or with Doyle before the operation began. Then, my rage cooled, and my mind went elsewhere for the moment when my eyes landed on one woman who wasn't bearing the standard appearance of a refugee prostitute. The pale woman reclining against a wall beside 2 drunk men arguing with one another was staring at me. She was clearly a prostitute as well, but when I caught her eye, she motioned with her hand for me to approach. I looked back to Doyle and caught his gaze, and he was already engaged with John, Nathan, and Ramos. I gave him a nod, and he gave me one back, and my message had been communicated. I'll blend in, and you catch my boys up on the plan. I turned back to the prostitute leaning against the wall. She'd obviously begun scanning for new potential customers when I looked away, but upon catching eyes with me again, she made the same gesture as before, and I approached. As I maneuvered around the packed tables and through the drunks stumbling around, the arguing men beside the pale prostitute were pushing each other towards the exit, and I stepped up to the woman. She certainly wasn't a refugee woman, neither in physical build or complexion, nor by what she was wearing. She was fairly pretty for a regular waster, looking mid-20s with long dark hair, somewhat pale ashy skin, tall black dusty boots, short jean shorts, and if I wasn't sure she was a prostitute by what I wrote above. Her bare skin from the waist up was exposed between the flaps of the unbuttoned whitish fur coat. Since there weren't any signs of a bra in the exposed portion of her chest, that seemed to confirm it. I positioned myself close by, leaned myself back up against the wall beside her, and looked out over the room, ready for a casual conversation before I inevitably declined her offer. I was surprised when the first thing she said beneath the noise of the packed establishment was, "Are you and your new Canaan buddies here to shut us down?" It took a moment for me to register what she said, mostly because it was the way she said it. The way she asked that was almost as seductive as if she was telling me what she would allow me to do to her if I paid the right price. I glanced at her, those dark red lips curled into a smile in the dim yellow lighting, and she gestured towards the table where Doyle and Pryor sat with my men. "Why would you think that?" I asked, trying not to give her the impression those words affected me the way they did. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see that smile widen. I can spot new Canaanites a mile off, even if the bouncers are too stupid to do it too. The three at that table before you showed up haven't had one sip of the drinks in front of them the past 10 minutes. I noticed that too. Just as Nathan asked earlier, Doyle and Pryor did indeed authorize the men to get drinks. Although the glasses before Doyle, Pryor, and Mr. Schmidt were mostly full, it did appear there was some of it they'd consumed. The comment from the woman on my left merely showed that they ordered the drinks, but they certainly weren't enjoying it, unlike almost everyone else in the establishment. Just then, my eyes scanned the room once more, and suddenly, it appeared as if a great many of the wasters had disappeared, and the rest of Doyle and Pryor's men were all I could see throughout the establishment. All I could say to the woman's observation was, "You just see them, huh?" Giving a nod towards Doyle's table as my eyes landed on Hudson and Ray standing beside the two bouncers by the entrance. Both of them were talking, and it appeared Ray was the only one enjoying the permission to drink based on the amount of liquid left in his glass. "I know there's more of you," said the woman, still looking at Doyle's table as she went on. "Those three are just the most obvious before your buddies sat down. Want to know how else I can prove you're a new Canaanite?" As she spoke, my eyes found Lockwood and Mitchell standing together close to two other bouncers by the entrance to a hall across the room. On the right side of the bar and near two other bouncers were Ankra and Lominori, two tribal converts part of Pryor's detachment, who I almost didn't recognize. The two tribal guardsmen stood near the edge of a table filled with their brethren of the wilderness, blending right into the surroundings. I landed on a total of 10 guardsmen in the establishment, but I knew from the constable's brief that Pryor and Doyle had brought at least a few more. Still, I felt myself absently answer the prostitute's question of how else she could prove I was a new Canaanite with a simple, "How's that?" As my eyes landed on McMahon standing beside the bar, engaged in conversation with a bouncer, my focus returned to the woman beside me when I caught her glance down at my hand. Then it returned even more when I felt her fingers gently turning the wedding ring on my finger. I clenched my hands into fists, knowing women of her type usually weren't above stealing, but she only gripped my hand even softer. Her finger tapped on my ring, and she then proved her point even more as she whispered, "My standard price is 4 Canaan coins or 50 bullets 9 mil up for 10 minutes. Just for you, though, I'll give you a full hour for 1 coin, no limits." She paused, smiled even wider when she saw my face, and purred, "I'm serious too. Trailer 8 should be free now." Immediately I stuffed my hand in my pocket, double-checking that my ring was firmly on, and replied simply, "Maybe if I was younger, unmarried, and if I didn't see my eldest daughter when I look at a girl as young as yourself. Thanks for the offer, though." She retreated, placing her hand in her own pocket as she nearly choked in amusement. "Ha, I like you godly men. Particularly the younger ones, no offense. Had a man like your friend over there but 2 nights ago." As relieved as I was for her to switch targets, my comfort level was still far below normal levels when she gestured towards the table. It was hard to tell if she was pointing at Mr. Ramos or Duncan Schmidt, since he sat across from Mr. Ramos. Either way, I irrationally felt the two near boys were in immediate danger, and I remained very uncomfortable. Seeing her propose new targets, my young friends of the guard, I felt the nearly overpowering urge to rush over and hug the two of them and keep them safe in this den of wicked women. All I could say in response to what she said about her previous customer was, "You catch the guy's name? Or know who his parents are?" She was smart and returned her attention to me, saying, "Yes, I did, but that's between him and I. Telling on my clients their parents or wives is bad for business. I'm sure you understand." I didn't understand. I also didn't like the way she winked at me when she said wives with that peculiar emphasis. I was done being toyed with, and after all the distractions this woman was excellent at creating, I remembered how she began our talk and said, "So you know there's a lot of new Canaanites here tonight? What's your point? You gonna report to the bouncers or something?" Then she reminded me of the other part of her introduction, saying, "I just can't imagine why a man who turns down an offer like the one I gave you would come here with so many of his friends. You know, other than to shut us down, of course. I also imagine you're packing tonight, and not just that snake in those ill-fitting trousers." At this, I brushed my hand against the grip of the pistol on my right hip, and nearly jumped when she brushed her hand against the part of me reserved for my wife alone. At the same time, she said the word snake. The face I made must have been something sinister or righteous, because she returned her hand to the pocket of her coat in an instant and chuckled before I physically shook my head back into focus and asked her, "So what if we are here to shut this place down?" While doing my best to make sure my volume wasn't too high and internally screaming, "You may be able to tempt Eve, but you can't tempt me and my men, you snake." It was true she wasn't that attractive to me, despite how young and pretty she was for a woman of the wastes. But even if her charms were more than enough to tempt the men of Ramos and Duncan's age, her charms were definitely enough to at least throw me internally off balance. Either way, the moment sobered up, and perhaps she realized the level of my discomfort, because she turned it all down a notch and replied to the question. "So what if we are here to shut this place down again, in a way I didn't expect? What's New Canaan's problem with prostitutes anyway? I thought Christ preferred the company of prostitutes over priests?" Then I guessed it was my turn to throw her off balance because I returned automatically, "I suppose that's something else he and I have in common." She really must have not been expecting that, because she snorted loudly to stifle a laugh. She and I remained in our own bubble within the packed room as she collected herself and asked, "You spend a lot of time with prostitutes? You certainly don't act like it." I shrugged. "Give me the chance to talk to the elders or talk to you. I think I'd prefer you. If not for services, then at least for amusement. Never had a man in the white robes, so I'm curious," said the woman, her chosen topics of conversation and suggestion of familiarity with our church just now catching up to me as she asked, "Did you get your orders to show up tonight from the elders and bishop, or from God?" All of that again was said in a strangely sexual manner, and even if the latter part was said with malicious intent, it certainly didn't feel that way when I looked at her young face and saw that smile. Then, her seemingly intimate familiarity with New Canaan came to me again as her words caught up with me. I squinted my eyes in study of her face and a mind filled with recollections of home when my mouth spoke for me. "Lila Yetter?" The young woman's face didn't change one bit as she replied very coolly, and with that smile, "Callie Carson. Carson ain't my real surname. Earned that for a hollow film I did in Carson City. Still not a Yetter, though." She extended the hand from her pocket towards me. "You?" I shook her hand, Paul Young, and both our hands returned to our pockets when she asked, "Who's Lila Yetter?" "Just a girl," said I before looking back to survey the room, adding, "Ran away from home to maybe 3 years back. Smart girl, wasn't home from mission for 3 months when she left." I let the rest die, and the young woman took in the view as well. "Got tired of being the perfect Christian girl and went to make her own way in the world, huh? By opening her legs for anyone who comes asking about price?" "Yeah," said I. "Still happens once every few years." I felt her gaze return to the side of my head and added, "Thought you might have been her." The woman's gaze went back to the surroundings as she said, "That's how you thought I knew so much about you all?" She was right, that was how I thought it. But since the girl wasn't the long-lost Lila Yetter, I lost interest, and figured her to have just grown up in a nearby township before finding herself in Carson City, Nevada. This lack of further interest was much to Callie Carson's sadness. I felt her look back at me, seemingly troubled by my lack of response to her question. After a moment, she'd moved on as well, telling me, "You still didn't answer my question about why you're here." I turned to her, feeling slightly unnerved about his stranger's flippant questions about me and my faith. I felt even stranger still that she wasn't a lost lamb, just someone who knew more than they should, but with seemingly plenty of judgments and wit about things they didn't truly understand. I turned to face her. "Am I here because of the word of the elders or the word of God?" She nodded, face still calm and that mouth still smiling almost gently or even understandingly. "Sure." Without even looking at her, I studied the faces across the room, seeing all the prostitutes of so many ages, and seeing all the dirty, unshaven, cackling faces of so many intoxicated wasters. I caught eyes with almost all of the guardsmen in the room very briefly as I answered her question. "I'm here because I see the kind of scum who congregate at places like this. Because I see so many women here who degrade themselves out of desperation. Because the women here, including yourself, deserve better than to offer so casually what men should be trying hard to earn. Because I see little girls here, some almost as young as 13 from the looks of things, taking a torch to their own innocence for a quick buck. I see their mothers or fathers letting it happen, and the men who partake. I'm here because I see my daughters all grown up when I look at your face, and how those amazing gifts to the world I raised deserve so much better than the best this lot could give or pay them. I'm here because the constable asked for volunteers to remove this stain bearing a facade of relation to our home. And I'm here because I was told by my friend what you all did to the man who came to you in peace with a simple demand on behalf of our community's leadership. The elders didn't tell me or the constable or any of my men here to do anything on behalf of themselves or God. We came here because we love our home, and we love you. We believe you and all those here deserve better than the literal stench and degradation of humanity shown in this place, even if we have to hammer it into you or drive you away to show it. I believe our God thinks you deserve more too, so I'll happily serve as an instrument of His if you believe that is the case. I hope that answers your question." There was a moment of pause that hovered between us, and it appeared to happen as she took in everything I said. The world outside our little bubble went on. Men carted women to rooms down the far halls or out the doors to the trailers, and the roar of laughter continued, while all the men of New Canaan stood beside their marks ready to act on their duty regardless of age or experience in a place like this. After a short few seconds, Callie the prostitute said, "I told them the name wasn't a good idea." Momentarily puzzled, that part was what caught her attention. I looked at her and saw her face was still calm, even if that smile was shrunken slightly and colored with concern. "I also want to let you know that I had nothing to do with the stuff that happened to that missionary guy yesterday afternoon. Not even addressing the stuff about the children I mentioned. I took that as something of a confirmation of my assumption, especially when she went on. I get it. I get your worry. I do. But just remember that there are a lot of women here that are going to have nothing and no way to support themselves if this is shut down, including yours truly." I met her eyes and her expression remained as I said, "We weren't asking the owners to shut down. Our missionary told you all just to move and to change the name to something less offensive to us." She nodded, seeming to understand, yet still, she replied, "Asking to move is still the same as shutting down. The bosses can't just move a whole trailer park 8 miles south." Before she could say anything else, I interrupted her, feeling even more in control of what was happening in this place. Perhaps this sudden, sincere sternness in my demeanor was a sign that Lieutenant Camden was nearby. Either way, I told the woman directly, "That is not our problem. There are other towns, neighborhoods, and service stations outside of our direct territory." Then she interrupted me, not angrily, not spitefully, just curiously, and as if she was still dealing with a somewhat disagreeable client. she said, "but that'll cripple the market. I don't think those whelps in the refugee village will be able to make it so far, especially the gals." As she said this, I felt the nearly uncontrollable urge to laugh and scream, how that was exactly the point when she continued. "The girls we have here don't have much other than their bodies to make money, and from everything I heard in the markets before this place was set up, is that New Canaan simply can't keep up with the demand of all the refugees." She paused, seeing what I was going to say had already died, and concluded, "You aren't helping the women here by doing this, you're hurting them. Here, they have some power over their situation." She let this sink in the way it did after I spoke, but as appealing as it was to my reason and sensibilities, it wasn't enough. This place was a stain. I knew the elders and charity workers had contingencies in the event of charity shortages, and although I couldn't list them for certain immediately after she was done speaking, I thought of my daughter and my wife. Places like this told all women inside of New Canaan, and everyone we tried to help, that sometimes it was okay to degrade oneself. Sometimes it was all right to abandon faith that something will come along to rescue you from having to lower yourself to such a degree. That was something I could not believe. There was always something else, whether you could fathom what that something else is in the dark or not. I knew that firsthand, and I loved my wife, my daughters, the refugee women, and even this woman too much to let this monument to degradation stand. As I said, you can trick yourself into saying it's liberation, or taking control of an unfortunate situation, but the truth is that it's pretending to assert some kind of control over some loss of innocence that happened long ago. Whether that loss was of your own volition or someone else's, the women here are not providing for themselves or their families. I won't have a place like this continue to tell my daughters and sisters of the community that a place like this can help in a bad situation, or empower them when I've seen faith rescue people in far worse predicaments time and again. Whether you hate me for it or not, I'll do what I can to destroy this opportunity for the women here to sell themselves and call it love, because that's what I feel it is. I want what's best for you too. And you deserve far better than this, because selling yourself is not power or control. It's sad. The woman looked as though she was going to say something else, but then stopped before it could escape her lips. She raised her shoulders a moment and then said, "I don't hate you." I turned back to the room, but felt her eyes remain on the side of my face when she added, "I don't think I really agree with you." Again, she stopped before proceeding. "I also know how useless it is to argue with a man like you New Canaanite types." This made me smile for some reason I couldn't quite figure. I think it was because of some sort of strange understanding between two people who, like in the old days, could still befriend one another even if they didn't agree on topics like politics, religion, or things like that. All I could say after that was what was true. I'm sure there's plenty you could argue against what I've said, but there's yet another truth that hasn't been mentioned. She perked her ears, and her expression returned to the one she bore before my sermonizing. This is still New Canaan's territory. Our authority will not be questioned or challenged here. What we say goes, and the simple answer to everything you or the owners of this place could argue will boil down to our community's only answer: not under my roof. The woman brought her foot up to the wall she leaned upon, exposing a slightly tattered fishnet-covered knee out from under her coat, and after a long moment said casually, without that seduction from earlier, "Lansing." I returned my attention to her briefly. "Sorry?" Seeing she was still looking over the room, I resumed doing so as well, and she explained. "Lansing is the guy you and your friends will want to talk to about shutting this place down." I took this in, nodding to myself as she resumed. "I never caught his first name, but he's the caravan boss who set this place up. The guy's from California, but led a pretty big group out here. Good eye for business, even if he's younger than me." I asked, "He the one you came in with?" "Nah," said Callie nonchalantly before elaborating. "I came in with Mrs. Dottie Norton from the folks out by Carson City. She's usually pretty uptight for something like this, but she knows a good opportunity, and Lansing is pretty smart. The boy even got Gus and his crew from New Reno on this, and his boys are serving most of the protection." When she was done, I thought out loud, "So Mr. Lansing, Mrs. Norton, and Gus are the operators, huh?" I didn't recognize any of the names, but I would have known if Mr. Lansing was with Happy Trails Caravan Company since both were from California. Our community would have had some strong words for Happy Trails if any of them were involved in this, since they were usually one of the more friendly trading outfits from out west. Either way, the woman replied, "Those are the big three, yeah." Callie adjusted herself against the wall. "But there's at least 10 other trading outfits from all over that contributed to this place, knowing they'd have to hold up here for the start of winter." I recited those names to myself in order to remember them later, but before either me or she could say anything else, I caught eyes with Doyle across the room, still at the table with Pryor. It appeared that only Nathan was gone from the table, and when I saw Doyle, I saw him make a motion with his head for me to come over. Without anything else, I pushed my back off the wall and said to my companion of the past 10 minutes, "Excuse me, I need to go, but it truly was nice talking to you." But before I could take a step, she stopped me in my tracks by saying, just as seductively as she did in her extraordinary offer to me alone, "Oh, no, you don't." I faced her and she added, "You forgot to pay me, sweetie." Her hands caressed my burly coat as her eyes looked me up and down like I was still a client of hers. With a confused expression, I told her, "I'm sorry. I don't believe you and I did anything you charged for." Still moving her hands up and down the length of my coat and speaking in that same tone, she said, "The fun stuff, no, but 10 minutes is 10 minutes." The part of me that wanted to argue was just as strong as the part that wanted to stuff her pocket full of money or bullets and get over to Doyle. However, before I could say anything or pull away from her grip that said I could not leave despite the delicacy of it, she said in almost a whisper, "You're a godly man. You don't want a sweet little thing like me to get hurt for wasting 10 minutes, right? Santos over there has been eyeing us pretty hard." I figured Santos was a bouncer who'd been watching us. But whether or not he was watching us, or whether or not she was lying about the possibility of her getting hurt for a conversation that didn't result in sex, I simply didn't know. What I did know was that I did consider myself a godly man, and she knew that whether she lied or not, I wouldn't allow even the possibility of physical harm to come to her. Reaching into my pocket, I withdrew a small jewelry sack that I knew contained 10 of our community's silver coins bearing the cross, and placed it in her hands. Her eyes widened and she asked, "How much is in here? I was just going to charge you my standard rate." She released her grip on my coat and I replied, 10. Consider it compensation for your soon-to-be unemployment. That or proof. You don't need to sell yourself when something else can come along if you have a little faith." I winked at her, she pocketed the money and winked back at me. I don't know if she would ever leave the line of work she obviously enjoyed, but with that exchange, I believe I let her know that the opportunity to change was always there. She looked back out at the room, and with her last words being, "I'll try to keep my head down," I stepped towards Doyle, praying it wouldn't come to that. Chapter 21, Booted from Paradise, Part 3. I didn't think much of Callie's last words she left me with, and I didn't have long to think about it either because I was soon standing between Doyle and Pryor across from my men. John nodded at me from the other side of the table, and Ramos had a peculiar look on his face when he darted his gaze back toward the prostitute whose company I just departed. Looking back at me, I saw Ramos about to say something over the noise of the even more crowded establishment, when his thoughts of speaking were interrupted by a skinny white girl dressed a bit like Callie who sat on his lap. I believe the woman who sat on Ramos's lap said her name was Misty, but I gave it no mind and noticed the chair where Nathan sat was still empty when I felt Doyle pull on my coat. I lowered myself and he only said, "Go get a drink at the bar with Nathan and bring him back here, should be go time very soon." I was going to ask him what the signal was, or how soon till Camden arrived, but his only response was to make a gesture with his head toward the bar, and that was that. My youngest guardsman was still red in the face by the pretty girl sitting on his lap, but I knew he was in company that would keep him safe, so I proceeded towards the bar, leaving Mr. Schmidt a pat on the shoulder as I went. Weaving through the crowds, I was surprised that the place was even busier than when we arrived. Most of those indulging in the establishment's offerings weren't even sitting, and yet, there was still one empty seat right beside Nathan. Taking my seat beside my guardsman on the rickety stool, I would have resumed looking around the place to ensure all the men were in their stations. However, Nathan himself captured my attention when I saw he hadn't even glanced in my direction since I sat down, although it was clear he had noticed my arrival beside him because the first thing he said to me after I sat down was, "Hey, Paul, what do you think a nasty nunnery is?" Bewildered by this, I replied automatically, "I have no idea. What?" I saw where he'd been staring since before I even sat down, and noticed the white chalk scribbled on a large blackboard, illuminated by 4 dim light bulbs on a shelf full of bottles. He said without diverting his focus from the blackboard for an instant, "I mean, I saw one gal in here wearing something like a nun outfit. Thought that was kind of cute." It's almost like the owners of this place have no idea New Canaan ain't Catholics and just mishmashed some generic Christian stuff into the theme of this place. I had noticed that, and even noticed 1 or 2 prostitutes in short blackish outfits. I figured that to be strange tribal garb while I was standing beside Callie, but now that it was mentioned, they did sort of look like nuns in a way. Then I recalled the few white crosses on the exterior walls of the building, while the interior was largely devoid of any reference to our home beyond the name of the place and the menu. Nathan went on, and I read the large board he was studying so meticulously that went something like, 10 minutes, 4 New Canaan coins, 50 bullets 9mm up, or 59mm, 20 minutes, 9 New Canaan coins, 110 bullets 9mm or 110 9mm, Holy Trinity, 15 minutes, 11 New Canaan coins, 130 bullets 9mm up, or 139mm, Garden Snake Special, 20 minutes, photo included, proof required, 10 New Canaan coins, 120 bullets, certified Canaanite, 10 minutes, virgin proof required, 2 New Canaan coins deal, nasty nunnery, 20 minutes, VIP, 12 New Canaan coins 150 bullets, 9mm plus equals 9mm. There was more. A lot more. So much so that the board on the wall was really hard to read. I figured the deals were something talked about with the women's clients themselves, and not something ordered from the menu. Either way, before I could explain to Nathan that I still had no idea about the answer to his question, I was confronted with one of the bartenders who only stood before me with a scowl on his face and a raised eyebrow. Before he could utter the "what you want," he clearly had on his lips. I told him bartender's choice. His face softened, and Nathan said with his attention still on the board, "Shouldn't have done that." "Explain," said I, seeing the bartender reach for something off the topmost shelf beside the services menu. "Look at him," said Nathan, nodding toward the bartender. "He's gonna stiff you." This wasn't news to me, nor was it the first time I had to buy alcohol in an establishment I wanted nothing to do with. I only told him, "I know." He shrugged, still squinting at the menu. "I almost want to try the nasty nunnery. You know, just out of curiosity." "Sure you don't want to take advantage of that deal for certified Canaanites? Might want to dip your toe in before you take a dive." "Can't, Paul. I'm not a virgin, remember? It says proof required." He thought for a moment, but how would they even prove that? By your social skills around the opposite sex, I'm assuming. That or the special is oriented towards our sisters within the wall. Easier to verify them. He chuckled. "Didn't see any males beyond customers here. Then again, maybe that's a point on its own. Speaking of which," before he could go any further, I interrupted him. "Before you go on about anything else, I need to know the sign." He looked at me in confusion for a moment and was going to answer me when he froze. I saw why he froze, and the bartender was standing across from me once again on the other side of the counter. With a small shot glass full of brown liquid between us, the bartender shouted over the noise of the room. "It's Brandywine's 1910 Arkansas whiskey, unopened since the bombs." There was a momentary pause before he nodded down towards the drink and added, "That'll be 4 Canaan coins." There was a smirk on his face, probably from knowing it was worth 10 minutes of Wastelander bliss. What most of the wasters in the room could only spend for the best 10 minutes of some of their lives, This bartender wanted to see if I would actually pay that for a single shot. The look on his face said that somehow he knew I would. Maybe he knew I was a new Canaanite, or maybe this was his way of testing to see if I was, or if I was just stupid. Either way, I looked him dead in the eye, knowing what we were only a few minutes away from doing to his employment, and handed him 6 new Canaan minted coins with the words, "Rest is for you, sir." The bartender let out a soundless laugh as he pocketed the money and went to turn away to serve other customers when my eyes alone prevented him from averting his gaze. Knowing he was watching me, I took the expensive shot glass and poured it out onto the already sticky countertop. The bartender broke his gaze with a confused and almost frightened look, and my attention went to Nathan as he said, "And there goes 4 silver pieces right onto the countertop. Then, here's a peasant like me with my muddy 2-bullet beer. What's the signal and when's it coming, Nathan?" I asked, returning to my demeanor from earlier. As per usual, it was hard to wrangle his attention. Seriously though, shame to waste that. I know he'll need the tip, but still. "What's the signal?" I asked him again, feeling that any second the signal could possibly come. He sighed and relented. 3 flickers of the light mean Camden's guys are in position. From there, it's up to us about go time. You taking the lead on this, by the way, or is Doyle? I gave my own sigh, thankful for the answer, and gave him my answer to his question. "I am. Just keep calm till then. It'll all be fine so long as nobody sets anything off too early and keeps natural." "Don't set things off too early? Stay natural?" asked Nathan, switching his focus back and forth from the board to me. "You mean like drawing attention to ourselves by wasting expensive drinks? You're the one talking about spending his entire month's pay on a nasty nunnery, so don't get lippy with me." I knew he was going to say he was kidding about that, but I did owe him some explanation for why I did what I did. Still, what I did is good attention. The attention I showed says that we aren't here to be bought out. We're here for our demands to be taken seriously and not negotiated with when it's go time. He nodded in surrender, still reading that board as I wrangled his attention to prove my point. Look at him now, the bartender. Right now, he's being a good little employee and probably telling his bosses about the expensive services he rendered to me. Nathan's eyes went to the bartender standing on the far end of the bar and speaking to one of the female bartenders, as well as a man in a black overcoat. I paid them no mind, only explaining to Nathan. Doyle said Camden will be along any minute and I believe him. In the meantime, we still have a job to do till the lights flicker. The worst that would happen by my display to the bartender was probably a few questions from the establishment's owners or bouncers. However, in my experience, such a thing would likely just bring about questions like, "What else can we get you?" Since a customer who wastes expensive drinks might also waste money on other things as well. Still, as soon as I told Nathan that we had a job to do, his eyes went back to me from the bartender on the other end. However, he stopped when he saw something and replied, "What a coincidence, look at this." Speaking of job to do, he tilted his head forward. I turned my attention back to the chalkboard instead of where he was looking, and my guardsman stood himself up to confirm something I only suspected before sitting at the bar. I refused to bring this up earlier out of an attempt to blend into the crowd, but before I sat beside Nathan, I saw the backs of 2 younger men occupying the bar seats just to the left of the empty chair. There was something about their frames and their lowered heads that caused my suspicion, but I shrugged it off since I felt Nathan would have approached them earlier if they were new Canaanites. Perhaps Nathan tried to ignore their presence beside him in the packed bar out of knowing them. Or perhaps he was really so intrigued by the service's menu to notice them. Either way, when I reminded him of our job to do, he stood himself up and placed himself between the 2 young men on my left, putting an arm over both men's shoulders as I continued to read the board with a whisper to myself. Good man. My, it can't be. What on earth could bring little Hector Belts and Calvin Willett to a place like this? Could evening mission prep have let out early tonight? Came from Nathan on my left beneath the noise of the room. Nathan always cracked me up, and I took mental note of the names, while a smile curled my lips, and I continued to look at the board. "Hello to you too, Nathan." said one of the near men of our home who I thought might have been the Willet's son. You know, evening mission prep is tomorrow night. I could feel Nathan staring deeply at both the faces under his wings, clearly enjoying this gotcha moment as he replied, "That's right. Must have slipped my mind. You boys don't get lots of free time. Figure it might be a good idea to get a couple of stiff drinks on a nice night off? Maybe lose that V-card before your first mission? When is that, by the way? Only a couple months to go, right? Start of March," said the voice of the other one, the Belts family's second son. "We're just here for drinks, that's all. Well, at least I am." "What are you doing?" shouted the voice of Mr. Willett at his friend. Both young men lowered their heads, revealing a crazy-looking grin on the face of Nathan in my peripherals. "Is that so, Mr. Calvin Willett?" asked Nathan, making sure to pronounce the name in its fullest and apparently enjoying this too much. "What in the world would your mother say about this? And what about Laura Miletto? I don't think she'll be too sweet on you after hearing where you spend your free time." "You're one to talk, Nathan," shouted Calvin as he raised his head. "You lost your virginity on mission. That's worse." I knew Nathan did some off-shift work with some of the young adults of missions coordination a couple times a month. As this scene played out, I couldn't tell you why exactly, but I found this confrontation between my guardsman of 24 and his friends, who'd yet to even take their first mission, so amusing. At the accusation from Calvin Willett, Nathan's resolution remained stern and authoritative, even if his words would have had me crying in laughter in another situation. "And I still write letters to Aliana Matuskrona every month. You gonna keep in touch with one of these floozies?" Despite the shouting, us new Canaanites at the bar were in our own isolated world, as the noisy one outside our bubble paid no mind to any of this drama. The Willet's son was going to say something else, but a violent motion of the hand from Nathan kept Calvin Willett in silence. Then the head of Hector Belts rose. "Why are you here, Nathan? What could bring you to this place when you're off duty?" The demeanor of both young men cooled, seemingly having caught Nathan as well. Nathan released his grip on the men, stood himself more upright, and replied simply, "I'm on duty now." "Oh yeah?" said the Willett son accusingly. "We all know you get off when the day shift ends at 6, so why is it 9 p.m. right now?" The young men seemingly felt satisfied until Nathan's short defense turned into another offense as a smile grew across his face once more. "I'm on a special assignment. See that man beside you, Calvin? You know who that is?" I kept my eyes forward but removed the amusement from my expression as the two faces beneath Nathan went to me. When both young men were looking at me, Nathan added, "That's my boss, Lieutenant Paul Young. I'm sure you know his daughter from missions coordination. Say hi, fellas." I could only see their faces in my peripherals, but they weren't wearing good ones as they both said slowly, "Hello, Mr. Lieutenant Young, and hello, Michelle's dad together." My focus remained on the bar, "Hello, boys," and Nathan leaned in, saying softer than before, "You think he's here for fun and drinks? You think Lieutenant Doyle, Pryor, and their men are here for a day shift team-building activity?" The return of Nathan's arms around the young men's shoulders prevented them from seeing where the men he spoke of sat. The young men didn't answer the question, and the dim lights across the establishment flickered 3 times very noticeably in the space of 2 seconds. The men's silence lingered. I saw some employees of the establishment make for the exit from a back room, likely to investigate the short power hiccup, and just then, I was prompted to settle this matter before settling the last one for the night. "Boys, finish your drinks and leave. You have 15 seconds. With Nathan's arms still draped over the shoulders of both young Canaanites, they did as I said, and swallowed the rest of their drinks in less than 5 seconds. I added coolly, "Good, now leave immediately. I won't tell your parents where you've been, but I also won't lie if they come asking, and that's the best deal you'll get from anyone else in the Guard." Nathan allowed the young men to stand, and he took his place by my side as I stood as well. After leaving me with a subtle, "Thank you," Lieutenant Young, Mr. Willett, and Mr. Belts were already moving hastily towards the exit by the time I rose to my feet. Nathan's face was back to business, and knew without word that the only reason I let them off with a warning was because I didn't deem alcohol consumption to be worthy of ruining their first mission, especially because they didn't engage in this place's other services. By the time the men were walking out the doors, I looked to Nathan and told him plainly, "Let's get to Doyle and finish this. I'm ready to go home." The employees who went to check the power generators out back never returned, and Nathan and I stepped up to Doyle, Pryor, Mr. Schmidt, John, and Ramos. By this time, the girl had departed from Mr. Ramos's lap, and the men sat eager to go, even if they were in the middle of something. It appeared that John, Ramos, and Mr. Schmidt were engaged in a deep discussion and paid no mind to Nathan and I's arrival. Once I stepped between Doyle and Pryor, I gave one last look over the scene. Hordes of dirty wastelander men filled the room. Women carted men to and fro. And the noise was so loud as the persistent smell of this place continued to fill my nose. Then I remembered something from before and looked through the crowds, seeing just through a small gap where those young girls were still huddled in the corner. I couldn't tell if any had left since I first noticed them on my walk over to Callie, but the possibility of them being made to sell themselves still persisted, and I leaned down to Doyle. "Hey, Doyle, you see those young girls in the corner over there?" He broke his attention from the conversation between the guardsmen at the table and immediately knew where to look. He apparently read my mind. "I don't know for sure either. Want to put some guys over there to figure things out? We can start whenever, so you make the first move, Paul." I nodded in acknowledgement and said to him without thinking about it, "I'll have John, Ramos, and Duncan move over there immediately when it starts." Doyle only said, "Agreed," and nodded, turning his attention back to the conversation, as I was already moving around the table to inform the appropriate men. Once this was done, I stood between John and Nathan's chairs, looking at Doyle across the table, and I didn't even need to ask. Over the laughing and indistinct chatter from all the voices around us, Doyle said, "As soon as this talk is over, I'm ready." Lieutenant Pryor beside him laughed, and both men turned back towards John, who was speaking. I hadn't caught more than a few bits of the conversation between the men at the table since I returned, but it was evidently very much about the purpose of this establishment. All I really caught was the end when John Langdon was saying to Duncan across from him, "Does that make sense? Just imagine being in a field all day in 100-degree weather, your wife on the loom the whole time, no air conditioning, and the last time you, your wife, and all of your neighbors bathed was 2 months ago. If you're a man obsessed with sex, and you can get over the smell of all that dirt and sweat and funk, and still think about sex with fondness, you're probably not someone an Israelite would want to hang around with. No better than this lot here. Get it? Yeah, I get it. Just doesn't normally feel that way. Also doesn't really explain some of the other feelings I get around places like this," said Duncan, almost inaudibly through the noise. "Ha," laughed John. "What do you mean? I saw that sour look on your face every time someone passed behind you, even when that gal sat on your lap 10 minutes ago." "But what do you mean when you say other feelings exactly?" Ramos began to say something, but I couldn't focus because my attention immediately went to Doyle and Pryor when they turned to look up at the burly bald man standing between them. My attention went entirely to them when they stood, and I was already at their side on the opposite end of the table by the time my fellow lieutenants were on their feet. The conversation had ended in a moment, and a brief glance back at the table showed vacant chairs and my 3 men already maneuvering towards the young girls in that far corner. I turned back to the man across from Doyle and Pryor, seeing the crowd around us had dispersed, and revealed 2 other thuggish men with bandoliers across their torsos and beneath thick leather jackets. The thugs looked at me briefly when I inched closer to Doyle, and then I heard the bald one in the middle say to the 3 of us with a sneer, "You 3 and your friends need to order more drinks or some girls or leave. You and your table have been here too long to still be on 1 drink, and we don't tolerate loiterers." "Who are you? The owner?" shouted Lieutenant Pryor in his best fake drunk voice. The bouncer said, "No, we're the janitors. We take out the trash and keep this place clean of freeloaders." "Well, let us speak to the owners then," said Doyle, not even pretending to be intoxicated. The thugs of this place clearly didn't have much tolerance or patience for anything, because the bald one said in an instant, "Nah, I think you and your men have stayed past your welcome. Leave now." To emphasize their point, The 3 bouncers all lifted the bottom of their jackets to expose large caliber pistols, as if to say they were more than willing to use them to earn their pay. At the sight of these weapons, and in direct defiance of the sinister faces those men wore, Doyle said in all his wonder, "Well, this is outrageous." He took one step back. "Something like this makes my friends and I so angry we could just stand on a table in protest of such treatment." As I stepped up onto the table, I saw the faces of the bouncers go from menacing to shock when Doyle and Pryor took out their own guns, and even more so when I drew mine. Pointing the gun at the ceiling, I fired 3 times, bringing the entire room to silence beneath the burst of the weapon. The fragments of debris floated slowly down from the ceiling, and after less than a millisecond of pure silence, the place was engulfed in chaos as the weapons of all the guardsmen in the establishment were drawn at once. Wasters and prostitutes fled out of the building screaming while the jukebox was unplugged and my gun stayed above my head. As the building emptied, some wasters drew their own weapons, briefly aiming them at me before realizing why the establishment's janitors weren't drawing their own weapons to defend against this apparent holdup. Then those heroic wasters saw the men holding guns to the heads of the bouncers and removed me from their sights at the orders spoken throughout the room. "Holster your weapon and leave. This doesn't concern you." The armed wasters all decided it best to not play hero and complied with the demand, vacating the establishment as the last of the general populace fled out into the cold December night. The bald bouncer who set off the operation was the only one still aiming a gun at me when the last customers were on their way out, but his gaze went all over the room, wondering why his men weren't doing anything before seeing the situation for what it truly was. All the establishment's customers were gone, and the place was vacant save for 12 thugs each with a gun trained on their person, and 3 wasters forming a perimeter around that corner full of young girls. There I stood, and when I met the eyes of the bald thug, he lowered his weapon, prompting me to ask, "Can I speak to the owners?" Before the thug could utter a word, a muffled voice came from a back room next to the bar. "What's going on out there? What happened?" The voice needed no answer because less than a few seconds later, the door opened, and out came a young man in a long faux fur coat over a dirty suit top with jeans. Following him and taking her place beside the young man was a woman of what looked to be around 40-ish with glasses and a perm who I assumed to be Mrs. Dottie Norton. Then lastly was a muscly bald man built almost exactly like some of the bouncers wearing face tattoos, and was who I presumed to be the man called Gus that Callie referred to. The 3 took their spots in the center of the room between my co-lieutenants and the thugs before them when the thugs fell back. The bartenders were frozen in place behind the counter, and when the owners came to a halt at the center of the room, the bartender from earlier said aloud, "That guy, there on the table. He's the one who wasted the drink." Gus shot a look at the bartender, "Shut up," then looked around at all his men, "Why aren't you firing?" before seeing the guns placed on each of the thugs. At last, I lowered my weapon from the ceiling and adjusted my footing on the tabletop as I met the eyes of the young owner in the suit ensemble. "You Lansing?" The near kid adjusted the flaps on his coat and said in almost a yawn, "Yeah, that's me. What do you want, and why are you shooting holes in my bar? Is this a stick-up or something?" I was already almost entirely disgusted by the fact a boy like this was running such a place and running it so well. This was the largest operation of this kind to open up in the Christmas season in probably 6 or so years. I briefly thought about the owner of the wagon last year, who was a rather kind and understanding mustachioed man who was agreeable to such a degree that we almost let him continue his mobile sex camper business there, outside the market. Still, this place, the popularity, and the demeanor of all involved were what shook me back to reality, and I replied to the young man in an instant, "We're here on behalf of our home to close this place, and I hear you're the one responsible for the enterprise." The young man put his hands in his pockets. "You must be that high priest Mordecai or whatever," said the kid, and my brain almost short-circuited at his assumption, thus preventing me from speaking anything before he added, "That's why you interrupted our little party back there?" Gus and I were having a good time, except Mrs. Dottie here. I didn't know what to make of that before he clarified. "Girls, come out. You're done for the night." 3 half-dressed prostitutes ran out of the back room, into the hallway, and disappeared in only a few seconds, likely disappearing into a storage closet or something, as Mr. Lansing said. "Sorry, I like business meetings to be entertaining, Mrs. Norton." The trembling woman beside him in the dusty suit and large glasses kept looking at me like I was there to punish her specifically. Either way, I realized I didn't care about any of this, so I spoke up immediately. "With the authority of our home, the constable, bishop, and the elders of our temple, we're demanding you close your business. In light of what you all had done to our emissary, we're demanding you comply without negotiation, and without the compensation originally offered." I saw Gus clench his fists a bit tighter, looking around the room as if to tell his men to ignore the guns to their heads and fire anyway. Mrs. Dottie trembled a bit more, and looked like there was a little more sweat on her face after the demand. Mr. Lansing, on the other hand, kept his casual demeanor, but my order clearly affected him as he said in something I could only describe as a calm panic. "Look, what happened to your emissary? What happened to that guy wasn't our fault. Neither me nor Mrs. Dottie, not even Gus, had that guy Daryl beaten up." I broke my focus from Mr. Lansing at the sound of the front door opening, and a brief glance behind showed it was Lieutenant Camden, who'd entered with a new Canaan 45 SMG in hands. He said aloud, "Lieutenant Young, Doyle, Pryor, I got 12 of my boys surrounding the place. All's quiet at the moment. The crowd's at bay." Pryor and Doyle looked back at him, and Pryor said, "Thanks, Camden. Stand by for now." The front door gave the sound of opening but did not close, and Pryor glanced back at me. "Go ahead, Young." Still thinking about what Lansing had said despite the entrance of Camden, I thought of what I knew happened to Daryl Fleischer of Missions Outreach when he came here yesterday. The bottom line was that I didn't know much, and he wasn't in much condition to tell about it from what I heard about how he ended up. I suppose it was possible that the owners had nothing to do with Daryl's condition, but that was irrelevant. I looked at the owners' faces, thought of how it wasn't their fault, and asked, "That's so?" Lansing shrugged his shoulders, his voice returning to indifference as he answered, "Yeah, the guy got up and started telling Mordecai, or whoever's demands, to everyone at the bar there. Our customers decided to handle him the way a mob would if you try to take away a dog's bone. I suppose Gus's guys could have done more to stop it, but you can't put down a mob like that." "Yes, you can," I said automatically while thinking, "I've seen Graham do that on his very own less than a few weeks ago." A momentary pause ensued before Lansing glanced at his business partners and said to me, "Either way, you go tell your elders or whatever what happened, and I'll give Mr. Fleischer's original offer another once over." I didn't know if I had the authority to comply with the negotiation, and wondered if the elders and constable would be willing to negotiate if they decided to believe in the owner's innocence. My thoughts of returning with the owner's response were put to rest, and I realized the only truth I needed to know about the situation, when Mr. Lansing added after a moment, "But you can leave now." No. Whether or not they were an innocent party in what happened to Daryl Fleischer was irrelevant. Our demands were a mere nuisance to them, something to subvert, or something to delay. I glanced back at the corner of the room where the little girls stood, frightened, barely clothed, and despite the question of their exploitation remaining unanswered, I could not tolerate even the possibility as I thought of everything said to Callie and everything I'd seen since entering this place. I took the authority upon myself and said to Mr. Lansing, "The new offer stands." The look of boredom on Mr. Lansing's face dropped to one of frustration or annoyance before he said, "And what if we don't accept the new offer?" The room fell even more silent, the only noise being the muffled crowds and their indistinct chatter beyond the windows and beyond the perimeter of Camden's men. I looked to all the faces holding the thugs at bay. Each one, no matter how young, was making me proud by their expression alone. All men of New Canaan in that room, no matter how experienced or inexperienced, bore the look of one ready to defend their God and their home, no matter the cost, with vicious intensity. They all looked as though they were the embodiment of Graham's ruthless sermon, and the brutality of what mercy can sometimes look like if tested too much. "And what if you don't accept the new offer?" I asked Mr. Lansing to reiterate. His only response was a nearly imperceptible nod. At that, I told him, Well then, tomorrow we're going to ask you to shut down and move far away from New Canaan once more." A great laughter erupted throughout the room. Laughter even from the bouncers with my men's guns placed to their heads and backs. Apparently, this was enough to calm the bag of nerves called Mrs. Dottie Norton, who despite her ongoing trembling was able to vocalize her amusement at such an inconsequential threat. All the while, the faces of every guardsman throughout the room had not changed in their intensity at all. I seemed to feel the eyes of all the men of New Canaan throughout the room at once in a single second, as if to tell me to go on. Before I could, Mr. Lansing subdued his laughter and asked me, "That's it? You'll ask us again?" "Yes, but tomorrow morning there will be 50 of us, all with automatic weapons, and explosive charges already set up throughout the compound. Some of Lieutenant Camden's men should be on the explosives part now." All the laughter throughout the room had died completely by the time I finished the last syllable. The latter detail was true, although I couldn't tell where they installed every piece of C4 and dynamite throughout the trailer park exactly. That task was one only myself and the other lieutenants knew about. It surprised me how not even this detail made the faces of my men waver in any conceivable way. The message was true, and one that cemented our resolution. We will be peaceful with you, and treat you fairly, but you will not push us. The thought of blowing up a building full of innocent or lost people was heartbreaking to us, and one we prayed we would never have to do. Although the explosives have come out for situations like this in the community's past, there have thankfully never been any recorded occasions where it was detonated. After all, the important thing is hardly ever what you would do. The important thing is what the enemy thinks you would do. If the tone in which I spoke, or the faces of my men didn't say how serious we were, the guns to the heads of so many thugs by otherwise peaceful men did. Either way, the threat or the mere possibility of the threat being carried out evidently worked, because after everything went silent, Mr. Lansing said in a tone of seriousness I hadn't heard from him yet, "You want tribute or a tax or something?" All I said was the word "no" in a voice devoid of all threat or intensity. The young owner began to nervously stamp his foot as he joined Gus in looking from guard to guard, as if to beg one of them to resist. Probably even more frustrated by the one-word answer I gave, he said frustratedly, "Please, are you sure? Surely we can work something out. There's a lot of people invested in this place and we literally just broke even." I cut him off, deciding it to be more fun to look at the bartender across the room from earlier as I spoke. "There is nothing to negotiate. We want this shut down. It will be shut down. The terms are non-negotiable. You can either comply at this very moment or enjoy your last night of operation, knowing that tomorrow you may not be in a condition to comply after the morning when we return." Again, the young man looked all around the room, seeing all the men under his employ with guns to their heads, and then back at me knowing there were explosives already installed around the compound that the man on the table was more than willing to use. I still prayed the young man would not call me on our willingness to explode a compound full of people, but I believe he knew that the explosives were a last resort in case they could hold their own against the 50-plus New Canaanites with automatics out in the desert. At last, Mr. Lansing stomped his young foot on the ground as if to put a hole in the floorboard and shouted, "Fine." I would have smiled in satisfaction if I had any less control over myself. Gus stood there with his mouth agape, either too angry or too upset by the loss of probably his greatest business venture. Mrs. Dottie continued her nervous convulsion, and then Lansing exploded with a finger pointed at me. "You're making a big mistake, though. I hope you realize that. You don't even know who I am. You'd know my dad if you religious freaks ever left this wilderness shithole. My dad's a councilman. NCR got no tolerance for those who don't allow free trade in or out of their territory." As the frustrated young man paused to catch his breath, I explained coolly, "And New Canaan has no tolerance for visitors who refuse our rules within our territory, especially when those visitors create a racket for exploiting women and even little girls." Lansing was going to say something halfway through my statement, but stopped when I uttered the last part. His eyes went to the corner, his face deadened, and he barked, "Whatever. NCR will hear about this, though." As I took a step down from the table, I took his non-answer about the little girls as its own answer. And on cue, every guardsman throughout the room pulled the pistols from the belts of the thugs before them. While Mr. Lansing continued stomping his foot and fuming, I replied to him, "And New Canaan will tell NCR what happened, if they aren't too busy in the Mojave to deal with the tantrum of a councilman's son." It took every part of me to not refer to Mr. Lansing as a councilman's spoiled brat in my closing words. The rest of Doyle, Pryor, and my men filed towards the door. Pryor saying to the room, "You all will find your guns in a bag off the caravan road." I said, "Y'all should start packing up now. We'll be back to check your progress in the morning," while Lansing and Gus continued to fume. And John, Duncan, and Ramos led the 12 little girls out into the cold asking about their parents. The next morning. I didn't mean to lie at the time, but it turns out we weren't able to muster 50 bodies the morning after. Then again, I only said that there were going to be 50 of us if they didn't agree to the terms. By the time we left the sack of 13 handguns by the green sign saying, "Paradise 1 mile this way," we could see the hordes of wasters leaving and the neon sign shutting off. So, instead of the 50 suggested, there were only a little over 30 of us standing in the middle of the desert, all with our automatics and long rifles, and me with a pair of binoculars satisfied that the closing of that brothel was still underway. A few of the employees from either Lansing, Gus, or Mrs. Dottie's caravans were pulling out the signs along the road to that trailer park, and after a few moments to ensure our presence was known. I saw a man atop a trailer look our way and wave us down. I waved back with my binoculars to my eyes, and knew our job was done when the unknown employee ceased his waving and held up a special finger towards me. I felt a euphoric sense of relief, and with the pack-up still underway, I turned to the men all mustered there in the desert and said, "Looks like we're good to go, boys." Although it may not have been the most exciting shutdown for a business like that in the history of New Canaan, I was more than relieved that it went so smoothly in spite of the potential for going so wrong. I never learned for sure if Mr. Lansing and Gus moved their business 8 miles south or not. The next 2 hours after we left our confrontation with the owners was spent reuniting the young girls with their families. It turned out that some of those girls were just standing in that corner while their mothers or sisters worked for the brothel, but some of them refused to talk, or couldn't because of language reasons, talk about why they were there. Either way, the children who didn't have parents or had parents of an abusive nature were taken to the gates of New Canaan. Some of the translators from the refugee village or missions outreach interviewed the children, and by the end of the night, 6 of them were adopted by the community. There was a lot that went into that, but by the time midnight came around, I was returning home. I told my wife I would tell her all about the assignment later, and that was what I did after the early morning part was over, and I was allowed some additional time to rest. In the end, I don't know what happened to Mr. Lansing or Gus. It was evident amongst the wasters who came to us for the winter that they were very upset by the shutdown, while others just felt like they got what they wanted out of the place and were indifferent to the shutdown. Strangely enough, it was about a week later that I got to speak to Mrs. Dottie Norton and some of her people when I was doing one of my patrols around the market. Mrs. Dottie seemed genuinely remorseful for taking part in the brothel venture with Lansing and Gus, and told me she was about to leave and continue on with her caravan's original destination, despite the onset of winter. I told the poor woman that there was seriously no malice towards her and her part in the brothel setup, that all was forgiven, but she insisted on leaving when her mules and people were winter ready. It was actually during this talk that Miss Callie Carson came up, and I got to speak with her again. Callie still refused my invitation to come to New Canaan, but thanked me for not turning the shutdown into a bloodbath. I gave all the credit to God and reminded her of the offer to see what we're truly all about. A little bit of light showed when she said she would think about it after she was done with the business in Hanksville. Apparently, some guy paid a fortune and waited for more than 8 months to have Callie Carson and her colleague Miss Misty Pross visit with him at his home in Hanksville. The man said he was a huge fan of their shared work in the movie from New Reno called A Tale Between Two Leggies, or something horrible like that. Either way, I departed the company of Mrs. Dottie, Callie, and Misty, warning them that the region around Hanksville was reportedly very dangerous with Legion expansion. I'd never see any of them again, but although that could have been for any number of reasons, I tried not to think of the bad ones. In any event, Christmas was only a week away after that conversation, and after the kind of year I had, I was glad it could end on such a nice note, and without any bloodshed during the final operation of the year. Although things were bright in my life, the world around my home sat alone in the dark, and after such a year full of good and bad, I was more eager than most years to celebrate the birth of that light. It was only a tragedy that this incident sat as the formal end of a relatively peaceful period. Everything I've talked about in the world outside, all the problems, all the enemies, and all of that mess coming for us and the burned man was still inching closer, and nobody but God could understand what that would look like or how to stop it. Chapter 22, Christmas, 2277. December 24th, 2277. It always astonished me how cold it could get even in the late afternoon this time of year. With snow atop the mountains in every direction, and the overcast sky letting the occasional snowflake fall, I walked with my family and so many of my neighbors toward the temple. Joseph and Hannah were more than excited, shouting and laughing with their friends of the neighborhood, far ahead of the rest of the adults. I was more excited for the Christmas service than I was most years, but that was because of so many reasons. Overall, 2277 was an extremely mixed year. Near the start of it, I lost a friend on an expedition named Morgan Navarez, who, although he wasn't in my detachment, was a big part of the Guard community. I wish I would have mentioned him sooner, but with how much happened this year, especially towards the end, it has been hard to recount every tragedy and every good thing over the entire course of it. After a start to the year like that, I had many ups with community get-togethers, weddings attended, intimate talks with my guardsmen, countless Bible studies, successful expeditions, successful caravan escorts, and no matter if my days were good or bad, my family was the one constant this side of heaven that I couldn't be more thankful for. I felt my wife's grip on my arm and her head on my shoulder as we made our way to the final service of Christmas Eve. She looked up and smiled at me as a snowflake landed on her nose, and I remembered the look she gave me every morning this year and so many years prior. I held her head to my shoulder as we continued along amidst the conversations between neighbors to our left and right, and made eyes with my daughter. I was so proud of Michelle, and there I saw something in her eye right before she looked away, as if attempting to conceal something. I think I knew what it was, especially since that look made me recount the rest of this year. I remembered setting out with Gavin Salazar, Roy Sutton, Axel and Dennis Gates, Diego Marquez, Rowan Tomlinson, and of course, Evan Buller in mid-September. An expedition that was supposed to only be about 5 days around the north shore of the Great Salt Lake didn't make it past 2 days when we were set upon by the White Legs tribe just on the outskirts of the West SLC ruins. I'd never lost that many men at one time before, and perhaps during this time I still wasn't 100% over it. In fact, there was a reason I still hadn't refilled the ranks of my detachment and have been putting it off. That amount of loss was also the same reason I'd been keeping somewhat distant of Mr. Ryan's squad and preferring to spend most of my time with John Langdon and his boys so much lately. Perhaps I felt it would make it easier if I lost Rhines and his men if I remained distant, although the alternative stood where it would be even more devastating if I lost John and his squad. In the end, I remembered how that preference idea wasn't a good one either way you cut it, and no matter how much I may distance myself from those under my charge, whatever happened to them would still affect someone. It was that thinking that made me forget or bury what Evan Buller might have been to my daughter, and I decided right then and there that, next year, I would make it a point to spend more time with the rest of my detachment. As hard as the loss of those men was to get over and still get over, what happened next, what happened after my injury, was more proof than I thought possible of what God is capable of. Scarcely a month after that terrible event, I got to witness the return of a man everyone I knew thought gone forever, and I had the honor of facilitating that almost directly, and with the help of God. The second I had this thought, I looked over at my daughter again, gently released myself from my wife's grip, and put an arm around Michelle. The two of us froze there in the street as the neighbors passed. My wife put her arms around Michelle, and the girls sobbed silently into my arms, There was a lot going on inside of her, and perhaps she thought she'd be engaged by now or before her first mission, but circumstance and God's plan was not in line with her own. Even though she and everyone who passed us on that street knew it was a good plan, that didn't mean it was always easy, or one we could always understand. Either way, I raised my eldest daughter's head, kissed her on the forehead, told her everything would be all right, and the tears continued to stream down her cheeks as her mother took her in both arms, reminding her that her family would always be there despite the past and coming changes. It was there on this street, and before the last turn, before the town square and the temple all lit up, that I saw the nearly vacant patio of the Polsons' little cafe. Upon seeing my wife firmly had our daughter in her assuring and loving embrace, I saw the two men sitting by the lighted railing beneath the lights, and told my wife that I would join them at the temple. Without needing any explanation, my wife nodded and continued her care for Michelle, knowing I only departed her company in this manner for the most dutiful of reasons. As I stepped away and up to the little gate to the cafe patio, I saw my wife and daughter begin stepping away. Daniela gave a brief glance to the patio and then to me before she nodded and continued towards the temple with Michelle on her shoulder. The little gate gave a creak as I opened it, but that didn't disturb either men who occupied the patio in even the slightest, as I found myself standing over the shoulder of Mr. Saul Mathers and looking down at Mr. Joshua Graham. The two were so deeply engaged that they hardly noticed me, and although there was much I wanted to say to them, the tone around them told me it was best to wait, so I instead just looked at the other new Canaanites passing in the streets on their way to the temple as the sky got slightly darker. At sight of the entire Willett family, and their son I was most recently familiar with, I turned away before he could see me, noticing him, and heard Mr. Mathers say slowly in a voice full of emotion, "There was so much killing back in those days. We tried to do what we could, but it was never enough, and they just kept coming. You told me I don't owe you an apology, but I still feel that I do in spite of it."
You can thank God, Mr. Mathers,
said Joshua deeply. Before I even knew him, I cursed him many times for missing that shot. For a long time afterward even, I wished it would have landed, and I almost couldn't forgive him or even myself for that. Joshua stated slowly,
You know, it was probably around that time you were talking about that I started wishing I would just get hit. Although it took a while, I began to realize what I deserved, what I wanted, and what I was not allowed to receive. At least yet.
Still, I'm so sorry I held that against you for so long, and against God, said Mr. Mathers, allowing a long silence to hover between the two. After a while, Joshua said in his characteristic manner,
You have no reason to be sorry. You had every moral and logical reason to fire. It's just God that says you weren't the one to deliver it.
Mr. Mathers chuckled, seeming to swallow some apparent embarrassment before saying, It wasn't even that long after I was brought here that I wised up to the fact that God doesn't care about how many confirmed kills NCR has against you. He will work in his own time. Still, though, given everything we talked about, I'd consider it a personal favor if you absolved me of that old shame.
I forgive you,
said Graham hesitantly.
But I hope you forgive me too. At least forgive me for wishing you too had landed the shot.
I forgive you, said Mr. Mathers. After that, Mr. Mathers wiped something away from his eye, and the two lowered their heads to pray together, while I remained somewhat dumbstruck. I hadn't caught everything, but the prayer I heard certainly clarified what I had walked in on. While Mr. Mathers was with the NCR Rangers, he was on special assignment in the northwest quadrant of the Arizona Territory, and believed he had killed Joshua Graham in the guerrilla war the Desert Rangers were waging against the Legion in that area. Upon learning that he had missed, he couldn't forgive himself, and held guilt about that for a long time. It wasn't until Mr. Mathers had come to Christ that he resented his guilt about taking even such a man's life. Graham argued that Mr. Mathers was more than in the right for wanting to kill him, because that happened in a time where he himself was beginning to feel like he deserved death. Graham had absolved Mr. Mathers of all the guilt he felt in missing that shot. It was also Graham who admitted that although he would have preferred to be hit, the fact Mr. Mathers missed was what caused the deacon of today to be reassigned to the Utah wilderness and be brought to a place where he could but find the Lord he now served so well. The two had finished praying, and gave an amen before raising their heads, and neither bore the least shame for what they were talking about in the presence of a bystander like myself. It was their demeanor that made me start to feel ashamed that I decided to stick around and not give them the privacy the topic of discussion seemingly required. Before I could become too ashamed of this, and all at once, the men looked to me as if aware of my presence for the first time as Mr. Graham said,
"How have you been, Lieutenant Young?"
I shook myself to the present and patted the deacon's shoulder, answering, "I've been well. Didn't mean to intrude on your conversation here." No offense taken, said the two in unison. I smiled, trying not to make the situation any more awkward than the none they thought it to be, and replied, "Was just on my way to the temple with the family when I saw you two here. Thought I'd ask if you two would like to join us." This was true, but I honestly wasn't even thinking about that when I decided to approach. "Ah, Christmas," said Mr. Mathers with a nostalgic and happy twang in his voice. "I think it was exactly this moment last year that I was running late for the production. If you remember, I had a part in the pageantry last year and was getting into costume for the choir. I couldn't and still can't sing for the life of me, which makes me think we need a new choir director. But thankfully I didn't have a solo part." I could only reply with a laugh, "Remember that God doesn't care how well you sing just so long as you actually sing." The deacon added, "I know, I just felt bad for that poor girl next to me who had to hear it." All three of us chuckled at this, and I replied automatically, "I think I remember it was last year that my family and I were on our way out the door to service when Nathan came pounding on my door with an emergency the guards were dealing with just outside the gate. Turns out the emergency was just a bunch of wasters who consumed too much contraband alcohol singing Christmas carols. They said they were auditioning for the choir, and all of them were singing different carols while the conductor was there for show more than anything else. Every guardsman in the market tipped them well anyway, and I was glad to have seen it, even if it wasn't what I had in mind when Nathan pounded on my door, pistol in hand, while telling me the whole way how I have to be there to understand the situation." We all laughed again, Mr. Mathers in particular, finding extra delight in the story before we simultaneously turned to Graham without thinking about it. Was this crossing a line? Perhaps it was, but the automatic gesture left us wondering after a silent moment where he was this time of year last year. More people passed in the streets unaware of our existence as more of the lights turned on with the darkening sky. I was just about to inform Graham that he didn't have to talk about anything he didn't want to and suggested we make our way to the temple when he decided to answer.
"I think it was around this time last year that I had gotten my last letter from a man I considered a friend of mine."
He paused in recollection.
"Of course I didn't have many, if any, friends while I was leading the Legion, but there was one commander I got to see every now and then who I felt a strange connection to. The man himself would have been a pretty good man if the Legion hadn't entered his life, so that might have been what appealed to me. That's about all I can say about that right now, but it was probably around this time last year I received my last letter from him. I don't know what happened when his task finally got started, but I know what happened to the Divide."
I think everyone, even in New Canaan, had heard about a place called the Divide through caravan stories. Caravan traffic slowed in the south for a few months after stories of the Divide began to surface. I don't know where Death Valley is exactly aside from west of New Vegas, but whatever happened there gave way to stories about a crack in the earth and new storms of untold proportion down that way. In fact, it was because of those stories that it took so long for stories of what happened between the NCR and Legion at Hoover Dam to reach us. Either way, there wasn't much for Mr. Mathers and I to add to Mr. Graham's remembrance, aside from, "I think I heard about that," and my mind was stuck wondering about things far bigger than myself happening in other parts of the wasteland, as Mr. Mathers stood and said, "Shall we head off to the temple then?" There, at the bottom of the crowded steps, and beneath a string of white lights between two street lamps, sat my family. Daniela was standing, engaged in a conversation with the constable and his wife, Leslie. As I approached, neither the constable nor his lovely wife even noticed who I had in tow as I threw my arms around the two of them and joined my wife's side. My children huddled around us as well, and I gestured towards Mr. Mathers and Mr. Graham, feeling all needs to introduce them disappear as both were greeted so warmly as if they were known all their lives. The conversing went on as the sky got a little darker and more of the lights across town lit up. Mr. Mathers conversed with other officials from the temple and general population, while Mr. Graham stood idly off to the side. I felt the need to bring him into the conversations as he stood beside the steps in a long black overcoat, but that need went away when I saw that he was not at all alone. Every person who walked by us on their way up the steps, whether with children at their feet or by themselves, all greeted Mr. Graham warmly, even asking him questions or speaking idle banter on their way as though he had always been part of the community. I was dressed in my finest attire and cleanest coat, just like everyone, and just as the doors were opened and the elders shouted their welcome message, my family and I began up the steps with the constable, his family, and so many other friends of the community. Before stepping under the beautiful archway into the temple proper, the constable pulled me aside and asked if he could lead a prayer for those on duty during this time of enjoyment. This must have been known to many people because as he began, and my eyes were shut, I felt the presence of many other people joining us beside the doors. By the time he was done, and by the time my eyes were opened, I saw myself, the constable, our families, and our friends surrounded by nearly 100 people of the community. Everyone said amen all at once, whether their arms were around the constable or somewhere in the back, and the rest of the populace proceeded inside for the last service before Christmas Day. As Mordecai spoke his sermon, and long after the opening worship where everyone usually felt extra emotional, there came a point where I began to feel very sad. I felt strangely sad knowing that this, the beauty of the temple, was something I so rarely got to see. The sight of children and families all happy in the pews was something so rare for me when I remember how most sermons I hear are the ones over the radio on a Sunday shift atop the towers. It's not often I get to see exactly what me and my men are protecting, and the reminder always hits hard on occasions like this. I sat in the pews surrounded by so many friends and families I knew, feeling like everything I do and did throughout the year was worth it. All the loss, all the tragedy, all the horrors out there are all worth it when I see the smiles on the faces, all the families together, and all those lights covering the hall beneath that glowing cross in the illuminated glass. I became stuck in my head, and I could barely even hear Mordecai's words when I remembered once again what it took for me to get here. All this came about when my glance over the room caught the backs of so many heads I knew all too well. The heads of the people in the row before me and 2 seats left were those of the Buller family. In front of them, the parents of Rowan Tomlinson and his younger sisters. Beside them were the parents of Axel and Dennis Gates. Next to them sat the widow of Gavin Salazar. Near the front by the pulpit sat the widow of Morgan Navarez, and it went on and on. It wasn't until I heard the infant child of Diego Marquez begin to cry, and saw his also widowed wife stand up, that I could no longer take part in the present. It's hard to describe what a place like the temple during that Christmas Eve sermon was like, and I don't know how to explain my life on duty in a way that does it justice. Despite all I've written, I don't think I've even come close to capturing what all of this year, or what this moment on Christmas Eve was truly like. What do you even say when you're the one considered an honored guest at a wedding once or sometimes twice a year? How do you explain it when you're the one giving the groom advice on how to be a husband, how to raise children, and then give an opening prayer before a beautiful bride dressed in all white comes slowly down the aisle? You see that beautiful young woman with her father, ready to be handed over to a son of the community you hold dear, and wonder who you are to even be here in this moment. What do you see in yourself when you are the man who the beautiful bride gives a special kiss on the cheek and thanks you with tears in her eyes for playing the role you did in her new husband's life? What do you do when the families and friends raise a special glass to you and your men when you see all those happy tears of joy and then remember what you do? Very few at those weddings, or those celebrations, know what it's like to feel a bullet shatter your ribs, or know what it's like to pick out the bits of cloth mashed into a bleeding wound from a pellet of buckshot. How are you supposed to feel when you're the same guy who cracked a man's skull with the butt of your rifle and shot a hole into a man's throat not 2 months before you felt that bride's kiss on your cheek? It's always been so hard to understand how you were supposed to feel seeing all those happy faces and then remember that slaughtered party you and your men found in the wastes. You can't get the image of those naked bodies with opened throats and severed genitals or breasts out of your mind. You know most of the people at home have seen their own horror on their one, and sometimes only mission, but they couldn't understand what it's like to feel such anger and rage that you track down the ones responsible and make them suffer too. They don't know what it's like to fire at a human being, hear the gurgle of blood in a dying man's throat, and to beat someone who simply won't give up into an awful death. They could never understand, but strangely enough, neither can you. You don't get why you have to do that. You don't get why you come home and help your wife with the chores, help the kids with their schoolwork, and why the world outside can't just be peaceful. You don't get why you have to go out there again and again praying you won't have to do what you know you're capable of. Then one day that bride comes to you with tears in her eyes and streaming down her face, begging you for answers through tremendous sobs as to why you didn't come home with her husband. You simply have nothing to say. I live two lives. There are usually 1 or 2 sermons throughout the year that leave me disgusted when I hear words like love thine enemy, and am told to forgive myself for what I did or failed to do. I feel utterly humiliated to have even felt disgusted at such words since I know they're true. I know it's correct to forgive the enemies of the wilderness and myself for everything I did, but it's hard when you think back and remember so much that happened. As much as you think of the tears of that widow, those parents, and all those mourning, you're so lost in your own misery that you forget that it's not just you who's living through the pain. It's not that the enemy needs to be hated. It's that the grieving need to be loved, and all you can offer is what you can. No matter how little that offering may be, you know that even that task to love the ones you love is more than you're capable of. When I see the people all together at home, in this temple, I know firsthand what kind of year they've had. I know all the horror and tragedy they've been through, and there were so many times I had to be the one to tell them what happened out there. It was me who had to tell them the awful thing that would change their lives completely. I see the head of Mrs. Buller lean on the shoulder of Thomas, staining his light gray coat in tears, and know exactly what she's softly crying about. I see it all throughout the room, and the impacted survivors of so much heartache before I see the widow of Diego Marquez, still rocking her baby in her arms over by the wall. I see the innocents resting sweetly and quietly in the Marquez widow's arms, and I see where the wet eyes of the young mother are looking. They aren't looking at me for what happened under my watch. They aren't looking at the bishop for what to do, and they aren't looking at the lights over the archways for a distraction. They're looking up at that cross in the glass above us all. The choir takes the stands again, and I see the tears flow down the widow's face as she holds her baby tighter, but her eyes remain on that cross and all it stands for. Those tears aren't those of hate, spite, or sorrow. They're tears of hope and longing for something better she knows is there beyond this rock, beyond this wasteland, and beyond the misery of this world. She, like so many others in this place, including myself, know how horrible this world we inhabit has been and will be. But there she looks in awe and wonder regardless of the pain at what's ahead, as the halls echo with the words, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." She is not alone. I am not alone. My wife is not alone. My family is not alone. None of the people in the warmth of the temple or the cold of the night outside are alone. Not in this place or any other. And the people of my home disperse to the arms of one another at the last word of Mordecai's address. Amen. The choir in place, friends and neighbors embrace one another after such a hard year as the halls fill with the sobs and laughs of the grieving and the hopeful. I feel the hands of my children on my shoulder, that of Joseph on my left, and that of Hannah and Michelle on my right. I embrace them all as the first words of Silent Night carry across the vaulted room and into the world outside. Our lives will not be easy, and the next year will be as tragic, if not more, than the one we just ended. However, the sounds of grief and tragedy lessen throughout the room, as more of the choir's words remind us of what has been true since the dawn of time, since the days he was needed most. All is calm. All truly is calm this night, and whatever happens next, all is bright, and all will truly be bright no matter what kind of darkness is lurking in the distance, because he's going to be with us the entire time. I stand with my family, embrace my wife, turn to those friends grieving or quietly celebrating throughout the temple, and the congregation steadily departs into the night. Beneath the street lamps, the lights, and the gentle snowfall, the soft tune of Silent Night continues on the speakers across town. All is calm, and all is bright. And whatever kind of darkness was on the way, no matter how hard, it still wouldn't be anything he isn't capable of handling. End of act.